The house was in absolute silence. The usual noises of everyday life had faded away, leaving an eerie stillness in the air. Rosa, the woman who lived in the house, walked through the halls with a feeling of discomfort that she could not shake. There was something strange about the air, something she couldn't identify, but that made her feel observed. The house had been his refuge for years, but lately everything had changed. Something felt out of place. One night, while Rosa was sitting in the living room trying to focus on a book, the sound came. It was a soft cry at first, almost imperceptible, as if it came from a distant place. But after a few minutes, the crying intensified, as if the child were closer. A shiver ran down his spine and his breathing became heavy. The crying was strange. It didn't sound like a child seeking comfort. There was something distorted about the sound, something that caused fear to take hold of her. Rosa stood up suddenly, throwing the book on the floor. He walked towards the door of the hallway, looking cautiously around. The crying seemed to be coming from a specific place, a room at the end of the hallway. An antique cupboard covered with a layer of dust was there, like a monument forgotten in time. The crying came from there, from inside that closet. Fear invaded her completely, but something pushed her to investigate. He approached slowly, with each step feeling his heart pounding in his chest. The closet door was closed, but the sound kept increasing in volume, heartbreaking, as if the boy was calling for help. Rosa, with a mixture of curiosity and terror, reached out to the handle of the closet. As he touched her, a shudder ran through her entire body, as if the door was being guarded by something invisible, something that didn't want her to enter. With a superhuman effort, he opened the door. Inside, everything was dark and dusty. There were no children, but the crying was still heard, louder than ever. A cold air emanated from inside the closet, freezing his bones instantly. Rosa stepped forward, her breathing fluttering and her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind caused the closet door to slam shut. Rosa turned around, terrified, but there was nothing. No children, no sound. Only the silence that had taken over the house again. However, fear was still nailed to his chest like an unbearable weight. She decided to go to her daughter's room to make sure she wasn't there, alone in the middle of the night. When she reached her door, something stopped her. A small whisper, almost inaudible, but enough to make his skin stand on end. He turned the knob and went in. His daughter slept soundly in his bed, his breathing calm. Rosa breathed a sigh of relief, but something was wrong. The boy in the closet couldn't be a dream. It couldn't be an illusion. There was something there, something I couldn't explain. The following days became stranger. Each night, the boy's cry seemed to resonate louder. Rosa tried to ignore him, thinking that perhaps he was imagining things. But every time she approached the closet, she felt a pressure in the air, as if she were being watched by something she couldn't see. A few days later, he decided to investigate further. She remembered that when she bought the house, the real estate agent had mentioned something about a former tenant who had mysteriously disappeared many years earlier. However, he never gave much importance to that story. Now I thought about it with a growing sense of horror. Rosa began to look for information about the history of the house. What she found left her speechless. The boy who had disappeared into the house was a little boy named Lucas, who had lived there with his mother. According to local legends, Lucas had died under strange circumstances, and his mother had disappeared shortly thereafter. No one had seen the woman again, but the boy, according to rumors, never stopped crying. His spirit was trapped in the house, and the cry of his lost soul could be heard every night. The truth struck Rosa with a force that left her paralyzed. The crying child was not a living child. It couldn't be. It was the spirit of Lucas, trapped in some corner of the house, seeking comfort, seeking peace. But I couldn't find it. Something had kept her soul trapped, and Rosa soon discovered that this thing was much darker than she imagined. One night, after hours of listening to the crying in her dreams, Rosa woke up suddenly. The crying no longer came only from the closet. Now it was all over the house, echoing around every corner. Rosa got up quickly, ran through the corridors, trying to find the origin of that terrifying sound. He came to the dining room, and there, in the center of the room, he saw a figure. The boy stood there, his face as pale as death, his eyes large and dark, and his body covered with dark spots that seemed to move of their own accord. The boy stared at her but said nothing. I just cried. The sense of terror that Rosa experienced was indescribable. He couldn't move. I was paralyzed. She didn't know if the boy saw her or if her soul was simply lost, trapped in a state of eternal despair. The crying grew louder, more piercing, and Rosa felt the pressure in her chest increase. The air was thick, heavy, and seemed to get colder and colder. The child's figure began to fade, but his crying did not stop. Instead, a dark shadow emerged from the ground, taking the form of a monstrous figure. Rosa tried to back up, but her legs didn't respond. The creature advanced toward her, its icy breath enveloping the room, its vacant gaze piercing her. The creature slowly approached, and Rosa could see that its eyes were not human eyes. They were two dark, empty orbs like an endless abyss. A scream formed in her throat, but terror consumed her completely. The figure lunged at her, and before she could comprehend what was happening, the shadow enveloped her body, taking her soul, carrying her into the depths of darkness. The boy had been just a disguise, a facade for a much older, much more evil entity that had been stalking the house for generations. Rosa couldn't escape. The house had claimed her soul, as it had done so many others before her. Since then, the house has remained silent once again. No one dared to approach her. Passers-by said that on dark nights, they could hear the cry of a child, mixed with the whispers of something else. Something that would never stop hovering in the shadows of that empty house, waiting for the next lost soul to fall into its traps. And so, the legend of the boy in the closet became a warning to all who approached the house. No one ever forgot the terror that dwelt in its walls. No one except those who had already become part of its history. The house was quiet, as was to be expected at that time of night. A deep, almost oppressive silence that invaded every corner of the house. Joseph was in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Since his wife, Anna, had died, everything had changed. The house was no longer the same, and the emptiness left by it was unbearable. Everything in her life seemed to have a gray tinge, a sense of loss that couldn't be dissipated, no matter how hard she tried. Every night in her bed, she felt that something was missing, something that she could never recover. That night, however, the air was different, heavier. The clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning, and Jose still couldn't find comfort. Suddenly, the phone began to ring, interrupting the stillness. It was an unusual sound in the house, as rarely did anyone call him at that hour. The sound of the ringing of the call was almost deafening in the silence, as if it was marked by some kind of foreshadowing. Jose, confused and somewhat frightened, sat up on the bed and looked at the phone. He didn't recognize the number on the screen, but something inside him made him feel like he had to answer. Maybe he thought it was a mistake, some kind of joke from someone playing on his pain, but the truth was that he was too curious and at the same time scared to ignore the call. Breathing heavily, he picked up the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling, hardly knowing why he said it. At first, there was only absolute silence, as deep as there was in the house. Joseph frowned, wondering if it was a joke, until he heard a soft breath as if someone was on the other end of the line. A familiar breath, but one that I did not fully recognize. It was trembling, somewhat broken breathing, as if she were struggling to stay calm. And then the voice, soft and muffled, emerged into the earpiece. The voice that Joseph never thought he would hear again. The voice of Hannah, his late wife. It was unmistakable. "Jose, help me." The whole world stopped for an instant. His heart stopped in his chest. Anna's figure, her image, her voice had disappeared from her life months ago. But now, somehow, she was back. The feeling of terror invaded him completely. Was it possible? How could it be her? "Anna, no, this can't be happening," he said, his voice trembling, feeling his mind fogging up, but still clinging to the idea that it might be a hallucination or some kind of trick. "Jose, please help me. I'm trapped. I can't get out," Anna's voice told him with palpable desperation. Joseph looked around the room as if expecting to see something, some hint that he was dreaming. Everything was in place. Everything seemed normal. But the feeling that something strange, something dark, was beginning to settle over the house did not leave him calm. The call continued, and his wife's voice did not stop asking for help. Panic began to rise through his chest, choking his breath. I didn't know what to think, what to believe, but I had to do something. "Anna, where are you? What's going on?" he asked, almost begging, looking at every corner of the room as if she could appear out of nowhere in front of him. In the house," replied the voice, which now sounded more distorted, more trembling, as if something were interfering with the communication. Anne's voice died briefly away, and Joseph could hear some strange noises in the background, low noises as if someone is walking through the house. His breathing quickened and his hands began to sweat. Was he listening to what he thought he was hearing? "Who's there?" he asked, almost unable to articulate the words. The response was a low laugh, a deep, malevolent sound that chilled Joseph's blood. It was a laugh that didn't belong to his wife, but to something else, something he couldn't understand, something that had no form. A shiver ran down his spine. The phone began to emit a series of strange sounds as if the call was being interfered with by something else, and then the voice returned, but now it was much deeper, more ominous. "Jose, don't go. Don't go." The warning only intensified the fear in his chest. Something was wrong. Something dark and sinister had taken the place where he had previously lived with Anna. Joseph got out of bed, the phone still pressed to his ear, and with slow steps, began to walk toward the bedroom door. The sound of the ringing of the call, the buzzing on the line, followed as a constant reminder that something was wrong. Every step he took toward the door was a struggle, a battle between the fear that built up inside him and the need to understand what was happening. He sat on the edge of the bed, then got up again, and with trembling hands began to walk down the hall. The house was dark, as it always was at that time of night. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet seemed to resonate as a sign that something was lurking in the shadows. The house, which had once been his home, now seemed a strange and uninhabited place, full of presences that could not be seen, but that were felt in every corner. With the phone still in his hand, Jose approached the lobby and saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A figure was gliding down the dark hallway, a figure he couldn't clearly distinguish but which looked familiar. It seemed to be flowing, as if it wasn't walking but rather gliding. He couldn't see his face, but he felt the presence, as if that figure was watching him. "Anna, is that you?" he said, his voice trembling as if he were looking for some kind of comfort, something that would give meaning to what he was experiencing. The figure paused for a moment and then faded into the darkness. Fear filled Jose's chest, but even with the phone in his hand, he could not take his eyes off the hallway. A loud knock on the front door broke the silence, a sound so loud that it echoed throughout the house. Joseph took a step back, scared, as his mind tried to process everything that was happening. He slowly approached the door, his breathing being the only thing he could hear. When he reached the door, an icy cold ran through his skin, and a shudder shook him completely. He opened the door cautiously, but there was no one on the other side. Nothing, just the cold night wind. He looked back into the house, and that's when he saw him. In the hallway, a face that belonged to someone who couldn't be real. It was not Anna's face or anyone he knew. It was something else, something moving towards him, slowly approaching. The face was pale, lifeless, with eyes that seemed empty, but with an expression of despair. The hair was messy, and the mouth, which moved slowly, uttered words that Joseph could not understand. At that point, the call was abruptly cut off. The phone fell from his hands, and he stepped back, staring in horror at the figure fading into the darkness. The house was quiet again, too much silence, as if everything was suspended in the air, waiting for something else to happen. Joseph, paralyzed by fear, did not know what to do. Was his mind playing a cruel joke on him? Was it a dream? No, what I was experiencing could not be real, but the feeling that something dark had invaded her home was so strong that she couldn't ignore it. He felt a cold presence, the feeling that he was not alone, and at that moment he understood everything. The call, the figure, the voice of Anna. She hadn't been asking for help. She had been a warning. The house was now being occupied by something else, something that should not be there. The door to the hall slammed shut. The lights flickered and went out. Joseph looked around, completely surrounded by darkness. He was no longer alone. When Javier walked into the antique store on a cold winter afternoon, he didn't know his life would never be the same. The air was thick, full of dust and the unmistakable smell of old wood. The store, located in a forgotten corner of the city, seemed like a refuge for everything that had been left behind, for those objects that time had marked, but that still had something of value inside. Every corner was crammed with strange artifacts, broken clocks, opaque mirrors, unusually shaped furniture, and portraits of expressionless faces that seemed to observe the visitor with an eerie calm. Javier had been attracted to the store by a strange sensation, something inexplicable that had pushed him to enter. The owner, an elderly man, sat behind a counter full of more items for sale, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He didn't pay much attention to it at first, as his gaze was fixed on an object he couldn't stop staring at. A portrait. The painting was hung on one of the back walls. An ancient portrait of a man with a serious face, but with a penetrating gaze that seemed to follow him even from a distance. The man painted in the picture wore a white linen shirt and a dark hat, and his countenance, though calm, conveyed a sense of uneasiness that could not be ignored. The eyes, dark and deep, stood out with a peculiar intensity. Javier felt a chill run down his spine as he watched them. The shop owner looked at him over his glasses and, in a raspy voice, told him that the painting had belonged to a man with a dark history, a history that the townspeople preferred to forget. He said that no one in his right mind should buy it, but Javier, although bewildered by the old man's words, felt that something inside him was impelling him to take it. Maybe it was the feeling of being able to own something so unique, something with so much history. The old man, seeing that Javier was not going to change his mind, gave him the price, and finally the man took it. When he returned home, Javier hung the portrait on the wall of his living room, right in front of the sofa where he used to spend his nights watching television. At first everything seemed normal, although I couldn't help but feel a strange discomfort every time I looked at the painting. The eyes of the man in the portrait looked like move, but it couldn't be. I was sure I was imagining things. However, that feeling of discomfort grew with each passing day. One night, after a long day at work, Javier sat on his sofa, tired, and saw the portrait once more. This time the feeling was different. The eyes of the man in the painting not only followed him, but stalked him. No matter where he moved in the room, those eyes stared at him. A chill ran through his body as a cold sweat pooled on his forehead. He blinked several times, trying to get the idea out of his head. It couldn't be real. How could it? It was just a painting. But as the night wore on, the presence of those eyes made him feel more and more trapped. As the days went by, Javier began to see things that he could not explain. Sometimes, when he looked at the portrait, the man's eyes seemed to move slightly, as if they were fixed on him. Other times I felt something in the room change, as if the air was charged with a palpable tension. The shadows seemed to be longer than usual, and the noises in the house were intensifying. Creaking walls, barely audible whispers. He woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching him, and when he opened his eyes, all he saw was darkness. But he couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were stalking him even in his dreams. The situation worsened when, one night, Javier decided to move the portrait to another wall, in an attempt to free himself from the growing sense of anxiety. However, in doing this, something strange happened. As he lifted the painting, a feeling of extreme cold came over him and a dark shadow seemed to cover the place. The eyes of the man in the portrait were staring at him, more intense than ever. At that moment, something changed in the atmosphere of the house. Javier felt an indescribable panic, as if the air itself was pressing on him, as if something invisible was imprisoning him. He couldn't take it anymore and left the portrait on the floor, determined to get rid of it the next day. But that night was the worst of all. Javier woke up with a stabbing pain in his chest, as if someone was pressing his heart. He sat up in bed, looking around, and it was then that he saw something he would never forget. The man in the portrait was standing on the threshold of his room door. His figure was dull, blurred, but his eyes were still the same, those eyes that had haunted him since day one. It was not a dream. It couldn't be. Javier tried to scream, but his voice did not come out. Terror paralyzed him. The man in the portrait began to walk towards him, and with each step, the ground creaked under his weight. Javier tried to move, to get up, but his body did not respond. He was trapped, completely at the mercy of that evil presence that was advancing towards him. The man's eyes shone with a terrifying intensity, as if they had taken on a life of their own, as if they were devouring his soul. At that moment, Javier understood that the portrait was not just a painting. It was a prison, and he was the victim. Suddenly, an invisible force lifted him from the ground and dragged him towards the portrait. He tried to fight, but his strength was fading. The man in the painting watched him unhurriedly while Javier fell to his knees in front of him. At that moment, the air became heavy, almost unbearable, and everything around him began to crumble. The ground beneath his feet disintegrated and the walls faded into darkness. Javier was being absorbed by the painting. In a last-ditch attempt to escape, he managed to turn and see the portrait before being completely consumed. The man in the portrait was looking at him with a satisfied expression, as if he had served his purpose. At that moment, Javier understood that he had been chosen. The portrait had not only stalked him, but had claimed him. The house fell silent. The portrait continued to hang on the wall as if nothing had changed. Nobody knew what had happened to Javier. No one knew that, in that painting, there was now a new look, a new pair of eyes that would follow anyone who dared to observe it, catching the next victim just as it had done with him. The cursed portrait was still waiting in silence, ready to claim whatever was necessary to satisfy his eternal hunger. It all started one afternoon like any other. Joseph was at home alone as always. He was a man of quiet life, nothing out of the ordinary. His daily routine consisted of working in his office, eating a light dinner, and sleeping early. He had left behind a relationship that had marked him, and now he lived in this house with an air of loneliness that comforted him. The walls of her home, though gray and somewhat worn, had something cozy about them. There was something about them that gave him peace, though he had never stopped to wonder what it was exactly. One day, as he was getting ready to leave for work, he looked at himself in the hallway mirror. He was adjusting his tie when, for a fleeting moment, something in his reflection made him stop. It wasn't something I could identify at first, just a flash, a shadow that seemed to move behind him, but when he turned his head, he saw nothing. He was alone. He didn't think much about it, attributing it to tiredness or lack of sleep. However, that night, while in the living room, he read an article on his mobile phone about strange phenomena in houses. The idea of the paranormal began to haunt his mind. The next time he passed by the hallway mirror, he saw the shadow again. This time it was more apparent, as if the figure of something was behind him, watching, stalking. But he did not move. Joseph took a deep breath, turned around, and found nothing but the normal reflection of his own face. From that day on, the shadow began to appear in every mirror in the house. On the bathroom mirror, on the small mirror on the dining table, on the mirror at the entrance of the house. It was always the same shadow, always following the same pattern, moving slowly, as if it had a life of its own. Each time Joseph looked at himself, the figure seemed to draw closer to him, as if it intended to reach him. At first, Joseph thought he was losing his mind. It was not possible. How could a shadow have a will of its own? And how could he move through each mirror in the house? But as the days went by, the shadow's behavior became stranger. In the bathroom mirror, he could see how the shadow seemed to lengthen, stretch towards him, as if he wanted to touch him. In the reflection of the hallway, the shadow was beginning to change shape. It was no longer just a dark outline. I could see how the shadow formed a human figure, but it was blurry, undefined. Jose began to feel observed. It didn't matter where I was inside the house. He could no longer escape his own gaze in the mirror, the shadow that stalked him from the reflections. Every time I walked into a room and saw the mirror, I could feel the shadow getting closer and closer. He was no longer sure if he was only seeing what his mind was suggesting to him, or if somehow that shadow was actually following him. One night, after having been at home all day, the shadow became more apparent than ever. As Joseph walked down the hall, he felt a presence behind him. It wasn't like other times, when she had felt that something strange was happening to her when she looked in the mirrors. This time, the feeling was more real. The shadow in the hallway mirror seemed to move on its own, swirling around him as if to catch him. Joseph backed away quickly, his heart pounding. He looked around, but there was nothing in the house that could explain it. He ran to the dining room looking for something that could make sense of it all. Fear began to take hold of him. He couldn't comprehend what was happening, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, he couldn't sleep. He decided to stay in the dining room without taking his eyes off the mirror. The shadow appeared again, sharper, more defined, drawing closer and closer to him. He was a human figure like a specter, but with something dark about his being. The shadow seemed to be breathing, waiting for the right moment to move forward. Jose could feel the air getting heavier around him. Fear invaded him completely. He decided that he had to do something, that he could not continue to live with that presence, with that figure that stalked him from the mirrors. But when he looked back into the hallway mirror, the shadow was closer than it had been before. This time, not only was he approaching, but he seemed to be moving towards him in a violent manner. Joseph felt his chest tighten, that something strange was happening. It was as if the shadow wanted to trap him, to possess him. Terrified, he tried to run out to the door, but before he could open it, the shadow materialized. He was no longer a mere figure reflected in mirrors. He had crossed over into the real world. Joseph could see the shadow take on human form, a disfigured-looking figure with empty eyes and an expression of anger and despair. The shadow surrounded him, and he, in his utter panic, couldn't move. Terror had paralyzed him. He wanted to scream, but his voice choked in his throat. The shadow began to whisper in his ear, incomprehensible words as if he were speaking to him in an ancient language, one that Joseph had never heard. Desperation invaded him completely. Fear had consumed him. He tried to back away, but he couldn't. The shadow kept him trapped. It was as if he were in an invisible prison that prevented him from escaping. The horror of what I was experiencing made everything even more real. The shadow not only followed him, now he touched him, brushed him with his cold hands, transmitting a feeling of pure evil. Joseph closed his eyes, trying to escape, but as he opened them, he realized that the shadow was completely above him. His hands were no longer cold, but frozen, and they could feel him being dragged into the darkness from which he had emerged. Finally, the shadow absorbed him completely. There were no screams, no lights, no sign of life. Only the house remained silent. The mirror in the hallway, however, was still there, reflecting an empty image, that of an empty, gloomy room. From that day on, no one saw Joseph again. The house remained intact, but the mirrors never reflected the same again. In the hallway where Joseph had been trapped, the reflections were beginning to show a new figure, a shadow that moved slowly, waiting to be seen by the next one who dared to approach the mirror. The curse of reflection continued. In that home now there was only the echo of a dark presence silently waiting for the next victim to fall under its influence. No one knows what really happened to Joseph. What is clear is that, from that moment on, the shadows in the mirrors would never again be something innocent. Because sometimes what the glass reflects is not just a reflection, but something much more terrifying, something that can no longer be discarded by the human eye. The sound began subtly, almost like a murmur. At first he didn't pay attention to it. He thought it might be the sound of old plumbing or some broken pipe. But as the days went by, the noises became more constant, louder. They weren't casual noises like the creaking of an old structure, or the wind pushing against windows. It was something else. Something that froze his skin and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Martine's apartment was not big. It was a modest space in an old building in a city where the buildings seemed to be so close to each other that their walls often touched. It wasn't luxurious, but it was his. In his life, he had accepted solitude as a constant companion. With each passing day, the stillness of her home brought her peace. That peace, however, slowly began to crumble as the noises intensified. At first he thought he was crazy, that maybe he was losing his mind. Throughout her life she had dealt with stress and anxiety, but something about those sounds was just fine for her. Disturbing. They were low, almost unintelligible at first. A soft tapping, a deep vibration that didn't come from the walls but from somewhere below. Would they be the foundations of the building? The old elevator that went up and down at all hours? But the nights passed and the noises grew, as did the feeling that something was not right. They were no longer mere tapping. Now he could hear whispers, as if someone was whispering his name from the shadows of the floor below. The first real awakening of the restlessness occurred one night. After several weeks of hearing those strange sounds, Martin woke up in the middle of the night, agitated, sweat soaking his forehead. He sat up quickly, trembling, as if something had touched him. There was a chill in the air, a chill that did not come from the open window but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was then that he heard it clearly, a dragging, as if something heavy was dragging on the ground. He was not human. It couldn't be. The feeling of dread enveloped him completely. Without thinking, he got out of bed and went out into the hallway. He looked at the door of the apartment next door. It was empty. It had always been empty. There had never been anyone on the lower floor. Martine had investigated at first, looking for answers to those noises, but he had never found anything. Something didn't fit. Something in that building was completely wrong. He decided to take matters into his own hands. If the noises were coming from the lower floor and no one was there, then what was causing them? And why did he feel those noises calling to him, as if someone were whispering to him in the dark? The basement door was locked, but that didn't stop Martin. That night, armed with a flashlight and a determination that arose from pure fear, he went into the basement. At first, his flashlight barely shone a couple of meters in front of him, but as he advanced, the air became denser. The stench as of stagnant moisture filled his lungs and made him cough. Something was not right. Not only was the air strange, but the walls seemed to be full of scars, marks I couldn't identify. The feeling that someone was watching him grew with each step he took. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. Darkness grew around him, and for a moment he thought the world was fading away. Then a noise made him stop. A dull thud, a creak, as if something heavy was moving in the dark. Martin swallowed hard and kept going, although his body asked him to flee. Finally, the flashlight shone on a figure, a shadow in the darkest corner of the basement. The first thing he noticed was the shape of this creature. Its body was tall, skeletal, covered in pale gray skin that seemed to absorb light. The eyes, if I could call them eyes, were two black, empty orbs, glowing with a yellow, inhuman light. That creature was not human nor animal. It was something much older, something that was hiding in the shadows, feeding on something I couldn't understand. Martin could not move. He was paralyzed with terror. The creature, with slow but sure movements, began to crawl towards him. Every step he took echoed off the walls as if the ground was shaking. Martin tried to back up, but his legs did not respond. Fear had trapped him. The creature got closer and closer. A cold breath ran down Martin's back, and darkness closed around him. He could feel the weight of that presence, as if he were being absorbed by it, as if the shadows themselves were surrounding him, taking possession of his being. At that moment, the flashlight flickered again, and in the darkness, Martin could hear a whisper, one he would never forget. "It's too late." The shadow of the creature spread through the basement, and Martin, unable to react, fell to the ground. The creature silently moved even closer, brushing its skin with its icy touch. The creature then began to speak in a strange whisper, a murmur that seemed to penetrate its mind. He told him dark stories, stories of those who had fallen before him, those who had come too close to the lower floor and paid the price. There were beings, entities, dwelling in darkness, waiting to be awakened. Martin, hearing those words, felt his soul being torn apart. An indescribable fear consumed him, as the creature dragged him into the shadows. At that moment, Martin understood the worst of all. Not only was the creature a being who lived in darkness, but that darkness was his home, and he had stepped into his realm beyond what was allowed. Terror enveloped every corner of the apartment as the figure disappeared from their sight. No one saw Martin again. No one heard the strange noises coming from the lower floor again. The creature, however, continued to wait, feeding on the darkness and the lost souls that time and again fell into its trap. A few months later, a new tenant moved into the building, and that same night, the whispers on the lower floor began again. Whitehaven Island, a small, isolated piece of land in the middle of the murky waters of the North Sea, had been a mystery for years. For a long time, the few inhabitants who remained on its shores lived a quiet life, without much contact with the rest of the world. The island, though small and modest, was steeped in ancient history, full of secrets buried under layers of land forgotten by time. But all that changed on a gray autumn afternoon when a group of tourists, in their eagerness to know the place and its mysteries, decided to venture on the island without knowing what awaited them. The group never returned. Local authorities, alarmed by the unexplained disappearance, sent several expeditions in search of the tourists, but never found a trace of their presence. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and the case of the missing from Whitehaven went from front-page news to a story forgotten by most. No one knew what had happened on the island. However, the rumors did not stop. 5 years after the group's demise, things began to change. Stories were whispered among the locals of strange sightings and unexplained occurrences. Bright lights on the darkest nights, shadows moving through the trees, and unmistakable voices in the breeze that seemed to carry echoes of something lost. However, what most terrified those who lived in the vicinity was the growing number of stories about people who said they had returned from the island. People who had disappeared for years, but now walked the streets of the town again. At first, people thought they were simple coincidences, but as time progressed, the stories became more disturbing. No one seemed to be able to explain the return of the disappeared, let alone the strange behaviors exhibited by those who claimed to have returned. Many people were skeptical, but those who met these people soon began to feel a chill running down their spine. The people who returned were not the same. There was something deeply altered in their eyes, something that made them seem different, empty, as if they were living in a parallel reality, completely disconnected from the life they had known before. The whole town began to murmur. No one knew what had happened on Whitehaven Island. No one knew what had changed those tourists who at first seemed to be ordinary people. A sense of fear and distrust took hold of the locals, and those returning from the island could not fit in. There was something inhuman about them, something that couldn't be explained in words. At first, those affected tried to continue with their lives, trying to reintegrate into the village and their former circles. However, over time, their behaviors became more bizarre and puzzling. Some of them were talking about things that no one understood, as if they were repeating the same phrases in a forgotten or unintelligible language. Others were silent, with an empty and disconnected expression, as if they could not remember anything from their previous life. The people close to them were beginning to feel a sense of unease, as if something dark and dangerous was surrounding them. The town's mayor, concerned about the growing number of incidents, called a meeting in the central square. On the night before the meeting, one of the returnees, a woman named Clara, disappeared again without a trace, only to appear at dawn in the center of the village, covered in dirt and with a completely empty expression. The few witnesses who saw her came to an agreement. Something had changed inside her, something deeply disturbing. At the meeting, the villagers were frantically arguing about what to do with those who returned. Some believed they should be isolated. Others feared they might be a threat. Panic took hold of everyone when the stories began to arrive more frequently. No one knew if those who were returning were really the people who had disappeared, or if something else had taken them, altering them, transforming them into something else. It was at that moment that a young researcher named Samuel arrived in town. Samuel was a freelance journalist, known for his desire to unravel the darkest mysteries, and he had heard about the strange happenings in Whitehaven. He decided to travel to the island to discover the truth behind the returnees. With the approval of the local authorities, Samuel boarded a small boat to the island. As he approached the shore, he couldn't help but feel that something in the air was deeply wrong. The sky was covered by dark clouds, and the sea seemed more violent than normal. Whitehaven Island, which had once been quiet, now seemed to radiate an unsettling energy. Upon arrival, Samuel began to explore the island. In his first steps, he noticed something strange. The place was deserted with no signs of life, as if the island itself had been forgotten by time. But as he moved further inland, Samuel realized he wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was watching his movements, walking among the trees and moss-covered rocks. Samuel found what looked like a cave hidden among the hills. Intrigued, he went into it. Darkness enveloped him as he advanced through the narrow passage. And then, at the bottom of the cave, he saw something that left him cold. A set of strange symbols were etched into the walls of the cave, symbols that did not belong to any known culture. They were ancient, so profoundly old that they defied human logic. As Samuel watched them, a sense of anguish came over him. He felt as if something was awakening in the depths of the island, something he had been waiting for centuries. Suddenly the cave began to tremble, and a strange vibration ran through his entire body. Samuel tried to get out, but the walls seemed to move, closing around him. It was then that he heard voices, soft at first, like a whisper in the distance. The voices grew louder, closer, until suddenly they stopped. And then he saw something he would never forget. The missing tourists, the same ones who had returned to the village, were standing in front of him, their eyes empty and their bodies motionless. They were there, but they were not the same. Something had transformed them. Something had possessed them. At that moment, Samuel understood what had happened. The island had not only been a place of isolation, it had been a point of convergence, a space where dark forces had infiltrated the human world. The people who returned were not human. They had been altered, possessed by an ancestral entity that controlled them. And that entity had been patiently waiting for his return. As the island began to crumble around him, Samuel tried to flee, but couldn't. Darkness surrounded him, and the voices of the missing were transformed into deafening screams. The cave swallowed it all, and Whitehaven Island, with all its secrets and horrors, was sealed forever. The villagers never heard of Samuel again. The returnees, if they could still be called that, continued to wander the streets, their gaze empty and their soul lost forever. And the island, with its hidden terror, continued to wait for the next victim. A group of urban explorers made up of Laura, Tomas, Javier, and Susana found themselves at the foot of an imposing abandoned psychiatric hospital. The facade, of a somber gray, showed the ravages of time and the lack of care. Broken windows gave glimpses of cluttered rooms, and the front door, rusty and overgrown, seemed to whisper forgotten stories. "Are we sure of this?" Laura asked, the most cautious of the group, as she looked at the deteriorated structure in front of them. Tomas, who had always been the boldest of the group, smiled defiantly. "Nothing to worry about. We just have to do some exploring, take some photos, and get out before it gets dark. Everything will be fine." Susana, with the camera in hand, pointed at the doors of the hospital. Although his face showed a mixture of excitement and doubt, he didn't want to be left behind. "Come on, Laura. It will only be an adventure. If you're scared, just don't look," he said with a nervous laugh. The group moved forward, crossing the threshold of the hospital. The air was permeated with a damp, acidic smell. The echo of his footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, interrupted only by the sound of the wind blowing through the cracks of the broken windows. The hospital seemed deserted. The paint on the walls was peeling, and broken and dusty furniture was piling up in some rooms. However, an unsettling sensation hung in the air. It wasn't the simple abandonment of the place that baffled the explorers, but the feeling that something, or someone, still inhabited those walls. Javier, the most intrepid of the group, went ahead. Their footsteps echoed firmly, but their breathing grew heavier as they moved through the dark corridors. "This is too quiet," Javier said, stopping in his tracks. He looked around, as if he felt something wasn't right, as if they had never left. Thomas looked at him, confused, as his flashlight illuminated the broken hallways. "What do you mean?" he asked. "It seems that people left suddenly," Javier replied, pointing to some abandoned wheelchairs in the corridors and a table covered with yellowed papers, as if they had suddenly gotten up and run away. Susana walked past a broken window, looking out over the overgrown garden outside. While taking photos, he saw something strange. One figure, dressed in what looked like a hospital gown, was walking in the distance down a dark hallway. Susan blinked, and when she looked again, the figure disappeared. The cold air enveloped her, but she ignored it, thinking that perhaps it was just her imagination. "Did you see that?" Susana said in a trembling voice, looking at Laura. Laura nodded, but her face was pale. Without saying a word, he approached Tomas. "Are you sure this is okay?" he asked, doubt now invading his voice. Tomas, who was trying to remain calm, nodded with a smile that could not hide his concern. "Just a little more," he said. "We're going to move on, just to see what we find." As they moved further into the hospital, they began to hear distant whispers. At first, they thought it might be the sound of wind through the air ducts, but the intensity and clarity of the murmurs began to become unsettling. "Did you hear that?" Laura asked, her voice barely audible. Tomas tried to downplay the matter. "It must be the wind, there is nothing to fear," he replied, but his face had taken on a tense expression. They stepped into a darker area of the hospital, with endless corridors that seemed to move and change before their eyes. In the background, they saw a large room. The door was ajar. The light from their flashlights flickered, and the air became thick, heavy. Thomas pushed open the door, and the light revealed a chilling scene. The hospital corridors were littered with abandoned beds, but what they didn't expect to see were dark figures, with expressionless faces, walking slowly between the beds. The figures moved in an eerie way, almost lifeless, but it seemed that they were waiting for something. The light from the lanterns illuminated them only for moments, but each time it did, the figures disappeared into the darkness, as if they were fading shadows. What is that?" Susana whispered, her voice broken by fear. Javier, realizing that the figures were patients who never left, his heart raced. He remembered what he had heard about the hospital, about the stories of patients who stayed there after it closed. But he never imagined that those rumors were true. "We have to get out of here," Thomas shouted. But someone else's voice joined the cry, and it was not human. A distorted, sinister laugh filled the room. Suddenly, the figures began to move towards them, walking in a synchronized manner with slow but sure steps. The doors slammed shut, trapping them in the center of the room. The laughter grew louder, echoing in every corner, as if the hospital itself was laughing at her suffering. "We can't stay here," Javier shouted as he tried to force the door. Suddenly, the lights flickered and everything was plunged into darkness. The air became heavy, suffocating. The murmur of voices intensified, filling his ears with distant screams. In the midst of the blackness, something began to brush against the explorer's legs, something cold, with a texture that resembled dead skin. "Run!" Susanna shouted, pushing everyone towards the exit. But as they advanced, they realized that the corridor was getting longer and longer. Every time they tried to walk, the hallways seemed to move, as if they were being dragged backwards. "We're not going out. We're not going to get out of here," Laura murmured, looking terrified at the others. Fear enveloped her. The figures were closer, their faces warped and empty, moving slowly, as if they knew they had no escape. Desperation began to take hold of the group. The terror was palpable. The corridors closed around him. The doors were useless. They were trapped in a place that had never been abandoned. The patients of the hospital, the souls trapped in that place, kept walking the endless corridors, waiting to be attended by the doctors who would never return. "No, I don't want to die here," said Thomas, weeping as he fell to his knees. "What do they want from us?" Javier asked, his voice broken with terror. But the answer was simpler than they thought. They didn't want anything, they just waited like them. They hoped to be released from a prison that would never let them escape. As the laughter intensified, the lights came back on, revealing the face of the nearest patient. His face, emaciated and lifeless, stared at them. With a blank stare, he began to mumble something, and the words reached his ears with terrifying clarity. "You will never leave. Never." The mental hospital had been closed, but the souls of those who never received care were still wandering in its halls, waiting for someone else to arrive, never to leave again. Horror and panic invaded the hearts of the explorers as their bodies vanished, one by one, as if they had never existed. Finally, the hospital was closed again, and the figures like shadows continued walking, waiting for the next ones who dared to challenge their domain. It was a rainy afternoon when Andres returned home after a long day of work. Gray skies and thick fog covered the streets, reflecting a sense of melancholy that somehow seemed to fit the man's mood. It had been a particularly difficult day, filled with tensions and gloomy thoughts. As usual, when he arrived at his small apartment, Andres prepared to immerse himself in the emptiness of his loneliness. The television was off, the lights dim, the sound barely perceptible, and darkness was beginning to take shape in every corner. As he flipped through an old magazine he'd found at a flea market weeks earlier, something caught his eye in a corner of the room. A small, messy object, covered in dust and partially hidden behind a pile of books, stood out. Andres approached slowly, curious about the unexpected apparition. It was an old cassette tape with labels that seemed to have been torn off in a disorderly manner. Curiosity took hold of him. A sense of uneasiness invaded him, but he did not dismiss it. Instead, he took it in his hands, staring at its worn surface, wondering what it might contain. Without thinking too much, he placed it on his old player, not imagining the horror it would unleash. Sound began to emerge from the speakers, at first soft, almost inaudible. The melody was strange, ethereal, as if it came from a distant place, from a world that did not belong to reality. The melody seemed to creep slowly toward him, growing in intensity until it became deeply disturbing. A mournful rhythm was repeated, and a feeling of heaviness began to invade the air of the room. Andres felt a chill run down his spine, but something in him, an inexplicable force, kept him glued to the chair, unable to turn off the tape recorder. The music, though distant, seemed to call his name, like an ethereal whisper that slipped through his ears. Suddenly the melody changed. A deep, guttural sound began to integrate into the song, as if an unknown voice was singing from the shadows. The melody was a primitive song, an invocation of something dark and forgotten. It was then that Andres noticed something else. The room, which once seemed ordinary, now seemed distorted. The light flickered erratically, and the air had become dense, almost tangible. A cold sweat covered his forehead as he looked around, but he couldn't find anything out of the ordinary, just the room that was starting to feel strange, as if something was watching him. The sound became clearer. The voice that accompanied the music was female, soft but full of despair, a distant cry that seemed to be about to cross the threshold between the world of the living and that of the dead. In desperation, Andres tried to turn off the player, but something kept him still. The song continued to play with unusual force, and the pressure in the air increased, as if an invisible presence surrounded him. Someone, or something, was watching him. In an attempt to calm down, Andrew closed his eyes and tried to rationalize what was happening. He had heard stories about cursed tapes, recordings of voices from beyond, but he never thought that something so absurd could happen to him. However, the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense the feeling that something was approaching became. The voice in the song began to speak directly to him, without the need for words, transmitting an anguish that penetrated him to the depths of his being. The music seemed to boom in his ears, and as the minutes passed, Andres began to feel that he was not alone. The pressure on his chest increased, as if an invisible weight were crushing him. He opened his eyes, and there, in the darkness of the corner of the room, a blurred figure appeared, barely visible, like a human shadow. The figure began to move slowly towards him, and Andrew, paralyzed with fear, could barely breathe. His eyes tried to focus on the figure, but everything became blurred, as if reality itself was crumbling. The shadow drew even closer, and in a whisper that seemed to resonate in his mind, the voice sang with frightening clarity, "Help me, Andres, help me escape." A cold sweat soaked his skin as he watched, unable to take his eyes off the figure. Terror paralyzed him, but the entity seemed to be so close that he could feel its cold presence, as if it touched his very soul. The figure began to materialize, a female figure, ethereal and thin, with empty eyes and an expression distorted by suffering. Andres couldn't help but feel fear invade him completely, as if every cell in his body was being absorbed by the darkness emanating from the entity. The song kept playing, louder now, as if the melody was taking on a life of its own, ringing in his ears and making his mind fog up even more. Despite his attempts to flee, his feet were unresponsive. The woman's figure moved forward with unnatural grace, her face disfigured by an expression of despair and pain, as if she were caught in eternal torment. His eyes, empty and lifeless, fixed their gaze on him, and Andres felt an unbearable pressure in his chest, as if his soul was being sucked by the force of the entity. "You can't escape. You can't run away." The whisper turned into a heart-rending scream, and Andres felt as if the sound was going through his body, tearing at his insides. He tried to scream, but his voice faded, choked by the terror that enveloped him. The entity, however, did not stop. She drew closer, and the darkness around her seemed to swallow the light of the room, plunging everything into utter blackness. Suddenly, the music stopped, and a deathly silence invaded the room. Andres looked around, his breathing racing and his mind clouded with panic. The figure was no longer there, but the feeling of presence lingered, as if something was waiting, watching, lurking from the shadows. Instantly, the recorder began to spin on its own, and the female voice sounded again, louder, more intense, as if it were inside her head. "I'm waiting for you, Andres. I will always be waiting for you." Horror seized him, and in a last attempt to free himself, he tore the tape from the player, but he could not stop the force that enveloped him. The presence, the voice, the terror, everything he had experienced followed him. It didn't matter where he went or how many times he tried to flee. The entity from beyond had marked him. The song, the cursed melody, would never stop haunting him. With his heart pounding, Andrew looked at the fading room and knew deep down that the entity from beyond had claimed him. Fear surrounded him. The song would never stop. He was trapped forever in the darkness of the afterlife. It was a night like any other. In the dark house, lit only by the dim moonlight that filtered through the curtains, Leah could not sleep. Even though his eyes felt heavy, his mind remained alert, restless. There was something strange in the air, a barely perceptible whisper that seemed to come from under his bed. At first he thought it was just the shadows playing with his imagination. After all, she was a little girl, and her mind was often filled with fantastical stories when she was plunged into darkness. That night, however, the air in his room seemed denser, as if the space was charged with a presence that didn't belong there. Leah pressed the sheets to her chest, her breathing quickening, but forced herself to close her eyes, trying to sleep as usual. But then a noise broke the silence. A touch, soft but clear. It was as if something was sliding on the floor. Her heart began to pound, and the girl couldn't help but turn her head, looking towards the edge of the bed. Nothing. A sigh of relief escaped his lips. Maybe it had been a draft, or his own mind playing tricks with it. He closed his eyes again, but when he tried to relax, the noise came back, this time closer, louder, as if something was slowly moving under his bed. Leah stood motionless, holding her breath, her eyes fixed on the place where the noise seemed to be coming. There was something there. I knew it. A shiver ran down his spine, and his mind began to conjure up images of strange creatures, monsters that only existed in horror tales. Suddenly, a quick, almost imperceptible movement made her jump. Something moved quickly in the darkness under his bed. It wasn't a familiar sound. It wasn't the creaking of old wood or the rumble of the house. It was a whisper, as if something was moving with extreme caution, as if trying not to be seen. Leah got out of bed and, trembling, approached slowly, dragging her feet on the floor. Her mind told her that she should not do it, that she should stay in bed, under the covers, where nothing could reach her. But curiosity got the better of fear, and her small body, though trembling, advanced to the edge of the bed. The room was dead silent, except for his rapid breathing. Leah crouched, her face close to the ground, her eyes fixed on where the sound had come. I couldn't see anything. There was nothing under the bed, but the air was heavy, dense, heavy. Something was moving there, something she couldn't see but felt with every fiber of her being. A shudder ran down his spine when, suddenly, something tore through the darkness under the bed. A pair of bright eyes, like two small spheres of fire, slowly emerged, staring at her. Leah, paralyzed by terror, could not look away. Those eyes were watching her with an intensity that froze her blood. The space under the bed seemed deeper than it really was, and the girl couldn't understand how those eyes could be so close, yet at the same time so far away, as if they belonged to something that had never been human. The creature made a swift move, sliding backwards, disappearing into the shadows. Leah felt her legs falter, but she couldn't stop looking. He knew something was there, lurking in the darkness. Fear paralyzed her, but it also drove her to understand what was happening. At every moment, the creature seemed more real, more tangible, and more dangerous. Hours passed, but the girl could not close her eyes. I knew that something was waiting, that something else was going to happen, and I had to be ready to face it. The darkness was lengthening, but I could still hear the faint sound of something moving on the ground. A whisper that swept through the stillness of the room and filled the air with unbearable tension. Finally, the girl got up with the decision to face whatever was under her bed. Leah approached again, this time without fear, as if she could no longer escape the need to know the truth. He bent down and, with bated breath, looked directly into the dark space beneath his bed. Nothing moved. Nothing looked at her. But then, a thin, wrinkled hand extended a long, crooked finger from the darkness. Her skin was grayish, almost transparent, and the fingers seemed to deform into strange shapes as they reached out toward her. A terrified Leah took a step back, but the hand reached for her, touching her ankle with a coldness that made her scream. A shudder ran through her body, and the girl fell backwards, her heart beating so fast that she could almost hear her heartbeat echoing in her ears. With supreme effort, Leah got up, ran to the door, and rushed out of the room without looking back. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he made his way towards the stairs. The house no longer looked the same. The air felt thick, as if something was lurking in every corner, biding its time. The girl ran, feeling the pressure of that dark force that followed her, so close yet so far away. Terrified, she reached the ground floor. His breathing became heavier and heavier, but something in the corner of the room caught his attention. A shadow that didn't fit, that didn't belong to the light of the lamp. In that dark corner, the creature watched her, her body long and meandering, with bright eyes that stared at her, as if enjoying the terror that the girl felt. The girl, out of breath, took a step back, looking for a way out, but the front door was locked. The creature slithered out of the shadows, slowly approaching, enjoying the panic in Leah's eyes. She could feel the dark presence getting closer and closer, as if it was about to devour her. In a last desperate attempt, Leah screamed for help, but her voice was lost in the air, suffocated by terror. The creature extended its claws toward her, and before she could react, its fingers reached out to her, dragging her into the darkness, into the very darkness that had been lurking beneath her bed. Fear, panic, darkness, everything swallowed the girl. The house fell silent, but under Leah's bed, something kept moving, waiting for its next victim. A group of friends, tired of the daily routine, decide to venture out on a camping weekend. They sought to get away from the noise of the city, disconnect from technology and enjoy nature. The forest, deep and mysterious, seemed the perfect place for his escape. They never imagined that they would enter a nightmare that would mark their lives forever. It was a Saturday afternoon when they arrived at the clearing where they set up camp. Around him, trees rose like dark giants, their elongated shadows stretching in all directions. The atmosphere was dense, almost oppressive, as if the forest itself were watching his every move. However, in their enthusiasm for adventure, they didn't pay too much attention to the warning signs emanating from the place. After settling in, they decided to explore the forest. They entered a path that seemed to take them even deeper into the heart of the forest. As they walked, the lushness of the place became more unsettling, as if the vegetation enveloped them and hid them from the outside world. Soon they came to a small cabin that seemed to have been there for decades, covered in moss and with broken windows. The atmosphere was gloomy and decadent. "Should we go in?" asked Laura, the most fearful of the group. Everyone looked at her, but no one answered immediately. The place exuded a sense of abandonment and mystery, and despite the latent fear, a strange curiosity pushed them to approach. They decided to go in. The door creaked as it opened, and a heavy, stale air greeted them. Inside, darkness seemed to embrace everything around him. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick, as if time itself had stopped within those walls. However, there were no signs of life, no animal, no sound, just an absolute silence that was more terrifying than any noise. "What happened here?" muttered Tomas, the most adventurous of the group. He looked around, looking for clues that explained the abandonment of that place, but he found nothing that gave answers. Then, something caught his attention. A strange dark spot on the ground, as if something or someone had crawled there. He couldn't help but feel a growing uneasiness. The group began to explore more cautiously. They walked through the rooms, each one more somber than the last, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, except for an uncomfortable feeling that was intensifying. That's when Emily, the most outgoing of the group, heard something. A whisper, as if someone were muttering his name in the distance. His eyes widened and a wave of fear swept through his body. "Did you hear it?" he asked, trembling. The others looked around, but there was nothing, only the sepulchral silence. However, that unsettling feeling did not go away. Suddenly, as they explored the upper floor, a heart-rending scream broke the silence. It was Tomas's cry. They quickly ran to the source of the sound, but when they arrived, Tomas was gone. The place where he had been had only a trace of scrambled earth, as if something had dragged him with force. "Where is he?" shouted Laura, her voice filled with panic. The others didn't know what to think. Had it been an accident? Or was something much more sinister going on? Desperate, they began to search for Thomas, calling out to him, but the cabin seemed to offer no answer. The hours passed without finding any clues, but something else was happening. The air, once charged with stillness, now seemed to move, as if something invisible were watching them. Each sound seemed amplified, and the tension grew in each of them. As the night wore on, a sense of paranoia gripped the group. Fear turned to terror. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind seemed like a reminder that they were not alone. Something was lurking, something they didn't want to see. That's when Emily found something in the old fireplace, a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. He unrolled it with trembling hands and read in a low voice, "In this place, no one stays forever. Shadows walk among us, and when the full moon comes, they will all disappear, one by one." Panic took hold of them. What did that mean? And why was the hut so empty? And why had Thomas disappeared? They tried to flee, but the forest seemed to have closed in on them. There were no trails that would take them back to camp. Each attempt to return only plunged them deeper and deeper into a maze of trees. It was as if the forest itself was catching them. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own. When they finally managed to find their way back, the cabin was gone. What once seemed to be a solid, real structure had now vanished, as if it had never existed. Desperate, they began to shout for Tomas, but only the echo of their voices responded. Fear was transformed into pure terror. Tomas's disappearance was never solved, and his friends never spoke of what happened. However, each of them carried with them the memory of that terrifying night, a night that changed them forever. In their hearts, they knew that what happened in that forest was not an accident. Something dark and evil had awakened there, and now no one was safe. Years later, the camp was found empty. Investigators who tried to inquire about previous disappearances in the forest never returned. And the empty hut, which no one dared to look for anymore, is still waiting, lurking, somewhere in the darkness of that endless forest. The full moon illuminated the train station with its faint glow. It was a cold night, with the biting wind blowing through the bare trees that surrounded the place. The station was located in a remote and forgotten part of the country, a place where time seemed to have stopped. No one in the vicinity would dare to cross the track at that hour, and few dared to wait for a train so late at night. The train, called the last station, had a haunting history among locals. Many said that he never made it on time, but still people kept getting on board, as if an invisible force was driving them to do so. Tonight would be no different, or so it seemed. But it wasn't. The clock struck 11:45 when the train arrived silently at the station, with a strange screech of the brakes echoing in the stillness of the night. None of the passengers seemed to notice the strangeness of the situation, as if they were all immersed in a kind of trance. The train, long and dark, stopped gently, but its lights flickered erratically, as if it were fighting something that could not be seen. From the platform, Inspector Guillermo Morales watched the arrival of the train. It was his job to check the departure and arrival of the trains, but something didn't fit. This particular train was the last of the night, but something gave him a bad feeling. Looking at the car, he noticed that it seemed larger than usual, as if there were a strange expanse inside, a space that could not be identified from the outside. No one else seemed to have noticed. With a sigh, the inspector approached the train. The few passengers who got on and off the carriages did not look around, they only made their way quickly inside. There was something about their faces that made him uncomfortable. Empty, alien, as if they were under a spell. The faces of the travelers did not reflect any emotion. There were no children playing or conversations between adults, only silence and an overwhelming coldness. Morales looked away, uncomfortable, and went to the control booth. The train left at the appointed time, and there was a feeling at the station that something was about to happen, but it was still too early to tell. Hours later, at the stroke of dawn, the destination station, located in a distant town, tried to verify the arrival of the train. The station's clock read 3 a.m. when the phone began ringing. The destination station operator, a woman named Beatrice, picked up the receiver, ready to receive the usual night train report. But on the other end of the line, Inspector Morales' voice froze his blood. "There is no trace of the train. He didn't come, Beatrice. No one has seen anything." Beatrice was silent. At the destination station, everything seemed normal. The clear sky and the stillness of the early morning seemed to indicate that nothing out of the ordinary would happen that night. However, doubt settled in his mind. This train, like all the others, had departed from the remote station at its exact time. Where was it? "Have you checked everything, Morales?" asked Beatrice, although she knew that her voice betrayed fear. Morales took a deep breath before replying, "Nothing. There is no sign of the train. The only thing I know is that the train keeps passing through the stations, but it doesn't stop. He doesn't stop at any of them." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. What was happening? The idea that a train could simply vanish was a terrifying thought, but the feeling that the remote station was not connected to any tangible reality was even worse. The phone went silent for a long minute. Then Beatrice got up from her chair and looked around. The control room looked empty, even the lights were flickering. There was no sound coming from the tracks, just the cold wind blowing inland. The sound of the train never came. At that moment, something terrible happened. Beatrice saw how the lights of the station flickered and then went out completely. The air became dense, heavy, as if the atmosphere itself were being sucked in by something invisible. Suddenly the lights came on again, but it was no longer the usual season. The clocks were showing the wrong time, the train signals were out of place, and the air had become thick and murky. But the worst was yet to come. Beatrice walked to the window. From there he could see the track, the same night train, stopped at the station. However, something did not fit. It was not the train that had left hours before. This train was much darker, almost black, as if it were made of shadows. The carriages seemed to be deformed with a strange distortion on their edges, and the lights inside each of them were not a normal color. They were red, a sickly and unnatural hue. The passengers, or what was left of them, leaned out of the windows, their faces empty and icy, as if living dead. A heart-rending scream echoed from deep within the station, coming from inside the train. Beatrice backed away, panic taking over her body. There were no words to describe what he felt. He knew that something had happened to this train, something beyond his comprehension. He wanted to run, but his body did not respond to him. The train, which never stopped at its destination station, was now in front of her, but it wasn't empty, not completely. The passengers, those pale, dead faces, stared at her. Some began to move towards the doors, approaching the window. Beatrice could see them more clearly now, with her empty eyes reflecting the moonlight. One of them, a scruffy-looking man, raised his hand to the window as if trying to catch her. Suddenly, the station fell into a deep silence. A silence so thick that it seemed to crush Beatrice with its weight. The train began to move slowly, sliding into the darkness, as if somehow knowing that its fate was none other than condemnation. A curt whisper reached Beatrice's ears, a broken voice coming from the depths of the train. "We're leaving, and we will never return." The station, the train, and everything that had ever existed in that place disappeared with the passing of the seconds. The train was no longer the train it used to be. It was no longer a simple steel and steam engine. He was now a conductor of lost souls, of people trapped between time and death, on an eternal journey into the unknown. Morales never returned to his station. The disappearance of the train and its passengers was an irrefutable mystery. No one saw Beatrice or the passengers on the train again. All that remained was the echo of a distant whisper. The train will never stop. A man wakes up in a dark place, his breathing fluttering as his eyes struggle to adjust to the darkness. The space around it is impenetrable. There are no windows, no doors, and no indication that there might be a way out. The silence is absolute, but something in that silence is not right. There is a pressure in the air, as if the room were alive, watching it. He slowly gets up, his body tense, and begins to walk around the small room. Her footsteps resonate on the walls that seem to close around her, increasing the feeling of claustrophobia. Touch the walls with your hands, looking for any cracks or irregularities that might suggest that it is not completely trapped. But there is nothing. The surface is smooth, cold, impenetrable. There's only him and the fourth. At first, your mind tries to rationalize the situation. Maybe you're dreaming, or maybe you've been in an accident and find yourself in an unfamiliar place. He crouches down, looking for something on the ground. He finds a speck of dust, but nothing else. Nothing to give you any clue about its location. Minutes turn into hours, or so it seems to him, although he has no way of knowing how much time has passed. Suddenly, a whisper slips into his ear. It's soft, almost imperceptible, but you hear it clearly. His body tenses instantly, but when he looks around, he sees nothing. Just the smooth, cold walls. The whisper rings again, this time clearer. The voice seems to come from everywhere, an ethereal presence crawling through the air. The only thing left for you to do is get lost. Time is your enemy. The way out is in your mind. The man steps back, shakes his head as if that could scare away the voices. But the whispers don't stop. They intertwine in a tangle of unintelligible words, voices that surround and envelop him. At first it feels like a distant murmur, but soon takes shape, as if the whispers are her own thoughts, speaking within her. Don't think. Look no further. The way out does not exist. Panic begins to take over. His heart pounds, sweat running down his forehead as he paces back and forth, pounding his fists on the walls. No one answers. No one hears it. There is only him and this endless space that slowly devours him. The man falls to his knees, exhausted, his mind struggling to make sense of it all. But something stops him. Something inside him tells him that if he keeps looking for a way out, he will lose his mind. The voice, which seemed distant at first, is now completely within him, constantly whispering, pushing and pressing his thoughts. You will lose who you are if you keep looking. He grabs his head with his hands, squeezing it tightly, but the voices continue, and now he feels a pressure in his chest, as if the walls themselves are crushing him. He doesn't know if it's his mind, or if the room is really changing, but the atmosphere becomes denser, more oppressive. The air feels thick, charged with a dark energy that consumes it. His breathing is short, each exhalation an effort. You're losing control, the voice whispers, now closer, deeper, as if inside his mind. There is no salvation, there is no escape. Madness is the only door. He screams, a desperate cry that seems to dissipate into the dead air of the room. At first, he thinks he is losing his mind. He imagines that he is in some kind of coma, trapped in his own body. But the sense of danger is too real to be a dream. The feeling of being watched, the pressure on his chest, the oppression that suffocates him, everything is real. There is no doubt. He staggers, falling back to the ground, his eyes welling with tears as he observes the space in which he is trapped. As panic consumes him, the voices grow. They are no longer just whispers. It's screams, squeals, distorted laughter that torment him from every corner of his mind. The way out is in your madness. Let her in. He closes his eyes, trying to resist. He wants to think of something, anything that will get him out of this place, but he can't. The voices do not let him, and the more you fight, the stronger you become. You're falling apart. You are your own worst enemy. Leaves. Give in. It's impossible. The walls feel like they're coming closer, like they're being compressed against your body, but when you open your eyes, you see the same thing. The fourth remains the same, no doors, no windows. Only him, only space. But now despair has completely taken hold of him. The walls aren't getting closer. There's nothing physical to crush it. It is his mind, which twists, which is distorted under the pressure of whispers, of voices, of anguish. He feels the sensation of falling, of sinking into an abyss from which he cannot escape. He knows that if he keeps listening to the voices, he will lose everything he has been, that he will become someone completely different, someone who is no longer him. But he can't stop listening. He cannot help but fear what is to come. The feeling of being trapped intensifies when you start to see things. The walls move, bend, twist as if they were alive. The once smooth surface now seems to pulsate as if breathing with it. The voice tells him that it doesn't matter anymore. That reason is a prison from which he can no longer escape. Welcome to your end. You feel overwhelming pressure, as if you are being crushed by your own fear. But when he lifts his head, he's not alone. A shadow moves in the corner of the room, at first imperceptible but increasingly defined. The figure of a person, tall, with empty eyes that observe him from the darkness. You're lost, the shadow says in a low whisper, and the darkness around it seems to swallow the light of the room. There's no going back. He takes a step back, but his body is weak, his mind collapsing under the weight of despair. The voices now scream. The whispers have become a rumble, a deafening roar that fills his head, filling every corner of his being with excruciating anguish. The shadow steps closer, her empty eyes fixed on his. "Excuse me," whispers the shadow. "The exit was inside you all along, but now it's too late." The man falls to the ground, his body tense, his mind broken. Fear consumes him completely. The darkness envelops him, and the voices, the presence, the shadow drag him into the void. There is no escape. There is no salvation anymore. In this room without doors, the only way out is madness, and he has reached it. Finally, silence returns. But now, that silence is more terrifying than any scream, because in this room he no longer exists. Time stopped. The mind broke. Madness was the last door, and he crossed it. In a village far from civilization, surrounded by dense mountains and deep valleys, there was a place where the light seemed to behave strangely. Shadows, those that normally project naturally when light touches an object, were absent. No one in the village had a shade, neither in the morning nor in the afternoon. The inhabitants became so accustomed to this lack of shadows that, for them, it was as natural as breathing. They had been born without them, grown up without them, and lived in a world where the absence of shadows did not cause questions but was simply part of their reality. But everything changed the day a child arrived in the village. His name was Elias. He was an ordinary child, like any other in appearance, with bright eyes and a shy smile. He had dark hair and pale skin, something that made him stand out in a place where skin tones tended to be warmer due to the constant sun that never seemed to quite set. Elias didn't understand why he didn't have a shadow, but he quickly got used to the emptiness his body left on the ground. The first time he realized something wasn't right was when he approached a group of children playing near the central plaza. At first, no one paid attention to it. Elias was just another child. But as soon as he approached them, something strange began to happen. One of the girls, Sarah, who was normally cheerful and playful, began to visibly tremble. His face turned pale, his eyes widened with fear, and without warning, he turned and ran home, not looking back. The other children did not understand until suddenly they also began to feel uncomfortable. The air became thick. The laughter stopped, and everyone looked at Elias with distrust. He didn't understand what was happening, but something inside him, something dark, felt that something was about to be unleashed. That night, when Elias returned to his small house on the edge of town, he found something he would never have imagined, a figure in the window. She was tall, dressed in a black cloak that absorbed all the light around her, and her eyes, or what he interpreted as eyes, were two bright spots that reflected the moonlight. He couldn't see her completely, but he knew the figure was watching him. Terrified, Elias ran to his bed, covering himself with the sheets. The figure did not move, but the atmosphere was filled with a heaviness that made him feel suffocated. The next day, when Elias went out into town, he noticed that the looks of the others were different. No one spoke to him nor looked him in the eye. Every time he approached a person, there was a whisper behind him, as if the wind brought with it muffled voices, as if the shadows were beginning to form a presence of their own. Elias did not understand what was happening, but he felt it deep down. Something was following him. Something was waiting for him to make a mistake. One afternoon, while walking in the nearby forest, Elias saw something that left him paralyzed with fear. Among the trees there was a shadow. Not that of an object or a person, but a shadow that floated on its own, dark and distorted, as if it had been torn from a body and left behind. The shadow began to move towards him, moving quickly, as if it had a life of its own. Elias tried to run but couldn't. He was caught up in his own terror. The shadow was getting closer and closer, and with each step it took, the air became denser, as if it was being swallowed by darkness itself. In the village, things were also getting stranger and stranger. The inhabitants began to disappear. First it was just a few people, then it was more. No one knew where they were going, but at first they didn't worry too much. Later, disappearances became more frequent. The bravest tried to look for answers, but they all returned with empty eyes, as if they had been touched by something dark and incomprehensible. No one could see the shadows, but everyone felt something stalking them. Elias, for his part, was trying to understand what was going on, but his efforts only led him deeper into an abyss of despair. One night, while walking alone through the deserted streets, Elias saw something that made him stop in his tracks. In front of him, in the darkest corner of the square, was a circle of hooded figures. At first he thought they were people from the village, but as he got closer, he saw that they were not human. Their faces were covered by hoods that seemed to absorb light, and their bodies, although they had no defined shape, seemed to give off a negative energy. Elias tried to back away, but something grabbed him, something invisible, but with overwhelming force. The figures began to murmur, and the air was filled with an incessant whisper, as if the people themselves were speaking, but from a faraway place. Elias tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. I could only hear the sound of his heavy breathing and the pounding of his heart in his chest. Then one of the figures raised a hand, pointing to Elias. At first he didn't understand what was happening, until he felt a pressure in his chest, as if the air had become thicker and was oppressing him. A stabbing pain ran through his body, and suddenly Elias saw something emerge from his shadow. It wasn't his shadow. It wasn't anything he could recognize. It was something dark, something I had never seen before. A living shadow that twisted and stretched as if it had a will of its own. Elias tried to run, but his legs didn't respond. The shadow enveloped him, absorbed him, and with each step he took, his body faded a little more, as if it were part of a nightmare from which he could not awaken. At that moment, Elias understood the truth. He wasn't just a shadowless child. He was the shadow. His existence, his being, was a manifestation of what should never have been in that world. The others had no shadows because there was no longer any light to project them. Elias was the door between this world and the next, the bridge that connected two realities. His shadow, the one he had been looking for, was the key to unleashing something much darker and older than anyone in that town could have imagined. The figures surrounded Elias, and one of them slowly approached. His voice, though soft, echoed in Elias's mind like an echo from the depths of his soul. "You have come to reclaim what never belonged to you," the figure said, and its icy breath ran down the boy's face. "Now you will be part of the darkness, and the people will be your prison." The boy, now completely shrouded in shadows, was no longer a human being. He had ceased to be Elias, the common child, to become the shadow itself. And as the people continued their shadowless existence, they all knew that an evil greater than anything they could imagine had been born in their midst. Terror had come, and with it, an eternal darkness. In a city where the bustle of the streets never ceased, a painter named Sebastian was accustomed to walking through the forgotten corners of the antiques market. His life, although it had been marked by the stillness of his studio and the constant search for inspiration, always led him to enter those dark places where something could be found that would awaken the necessary spark for his art. However, this morning was different. Something in the air, something in his chest told him that something peculiar would happen. It was a gray and humid day. The clouds seemed to press the city, lowering the spirits of all those who walked its streets. Sebastian walked, his hands in his coat pockets, moving among the old shops, ignoring the furtive glances of those who sold his forgotten objects. Suddenly, a faint glow caught his attention. In front of him, an inconspicuous store, almost hidden among other more modern ones, invited him in. The wooden door creaked as it opened, revealing a dusty but fascinating interior. The shelves were filled with objects that seemed to have centuries of history, from antique clocks to mirrors with golden frames that crumbled over time. Sebastian didn't know what exactly had attracted him, but his eyes were fixed on a dark corner where a portrait was hung, half hidden among other objects. It was a painting of a woman, her expressionless face and a deep gaze that seemed to have something inhuman about it. Although the painting was somewhat deteriorated over the years, something in it caught him. It was as if the woman was looking at him, even through the centuries. The price was not low, but Sebastian did not hesitate. The painting seemed to have something special, something that he could transform into art. Without thinking about it anymore, he paid the owner of the store, who with an enigmatic and somewhat disturbing smile handed him the portrait. There were no polite farewells or recommendations, just a slight nod of the head. Sebastian went out, the painting under his arm, not knowing that this apparently harmless object would be the beginning of his doom. Back in his studio, Sebastian hung the painting on the wall. At first, everything seemed normal. The woman in the portrait kept her expression serious, her eyes fixed on some point out of her vision. But as the hours passed, Sebastian began to feel a strange sensation. It wasn't the discomfort of being in a dark room, but something more intense. A presence that seemed to observe him, something or someone that was beyond the layers of paint. At first, he tried to ignore it. He sat in front of his easel, painting as he always did, looking for inspiration for a new canvas. However, he couldn't take his eyes off the woman in the portrait. It was as if his eyes moved subtly but moving, changing direction every time he looked at them. Sebastian couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sometimes the eyes seemed to be fixed directly on him. Other times they looked around as if the woman was aware of his presence. The painter, disturbed, got up from his chair and approached the portrait. The painting didn't seem to have any damage, but when he looked at it closely, Sebastian felt a cold run down his spine. There was something odd about the details, something he couldn't identify, but which disturbed him deeply. Maybe it was his own mind playing tricks with him, he thought. Or perhaps something in the painting had altered his perception. The days passed, but the feeling of unease increased. Sebastian began to lose sleep. His nights were interrupted by the constant feeling that the woman in the portrait was watching him, even when he was out of his studio. The figure in the painting seemed more and more real, closer, as if at some point he was going to leave the canvas and walk through his studio. During the nights, he heard soft whispers, as if the painting was calling him. He often woke up in cold sweats, looking up at the portrait that now seemed to breathe next to him. The painter tried to change rooms, but no matter where he went, the feeling was still there, persistent, enveloping. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the portrait, her fixed, piercing gaze that seemed to follow him at every turn. One day, exhausted by lack of rest and mental pressure, he decided to face his fear. He approached the painting and, with a mixture of fear and determination, touched it. What happened next was something I couldn't have anticipated. Upon contact with his hand, the paint seemed to vibrate. Sebastian, confused and afraid, quickly backed away. But the eyes of the woman in the portrait followed his movements, and somehow a macabre smile was drawn on his face. It wasn't a normal smile, but a distorted expression, one that didn't belong in this world. Terrified, the painter tried to remove the paint from the wall. Yet the image clung to it, as if it were glued to the wall by something invisible, something beyond the painting itself. Every time he pulled on her, the woman in the portrait seemed to come alive. The room was filled with an icy wind surrounding him, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the painting itself. Sebastian felt his strength fade as he struggled against an invisible presence. something he couldn't see but felt close. His breathing was getting faster, his heart was pounding, and fear was completely overpowering him. He couldn't escape. He couldn't move from the room. It was then that she heard his name, whispered in his ears like a distant echo. Sebastian. It was the woman's voice. The voice came from the painting, echoing in his mind and filling his body with a terror he had never experienced. He tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat, unable to make a sound. Fear paralyzed him completely. And in that instant, the woman's eyes moved for the last time, approaching him. In the last look, he saw something far beyond the physical, something deeper and darker. The woman in the portrait was not simply an image, but a being trapped in an eternal cycle, condemned to observe and be observed. Sebastian didn't understand it at the time, but he knew. The last portrait was not just a painting, but a door, a link to something that did not belong to this world. The painting, which until that moment had remained static, came to life. The figure of the woman began to overflow from the canvas, deforming and transforming into something indescribable, something grotesque. The form that stood before Sebastian was not human, but a monstrosity, a shadow of its former self. The eyes, which had once been only an illusion, were now fixed on him, filled with hatred and despair. Panic took hold of Sebastian, who tried to flee, but his legs did not respond. I couldn't move them. Suddenly, the woman's figure, now completely out of the portrait, pounced on him. Sebastian screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the darkness that enveloped him. In the final instant before being devoured by the shadow, he understood that the painting had not been just a portrait, but a portal to eternal suffering. A suffering shared with all those who had witnessed its existence. And so, in the very darkness he had feared, Sebastian disappeared. The painting, now empty of its presence, returned to its original state. No one saw the painting again, not even Sebastian. The antique shop closed shortly after, and the painting disappeared as if it had never existed. Only an unfathomable void remained, a distant echo of a cry that was never heard. But in some forgotten corner of the world, that painting still waits, silently watching whoever dares to look at it, waiting for someone else to become its latest victim. The cold morning air seemed to envelop them in a thick mist that slid through the trees like an entity unto itself. The group of friends, 5 in all, were slowly advancing along the path that led them to the heart of the forest. Every step they took was accompanied by the rustling of dry leaves beneath their feet, a sound that seemed to be amplified in the absolute silence around them. Carlos, the most enthusiastic of the group, led the way with a flashlight in his hand, his face illuminated by the warm light that contrasted with the gray of the landscape. Behind him was Lucia, his best friend, followed by Eduardo, Javier, and Laura. Everyone, gasping for breath, stood together, looking straight ahead, where the forest seemed to grow denser with each step. "Are you sure this is the house?" Lucia asked, with a tone that denoted a certain fear, although she tried to hide it. "Of course," Carlos replied with a confident smile. "I have checked it. I've been here before, but I never dared to go in. Today will be different." Eduardo, always the most skeptical, raised an eyebrow, looking at the shadows that seemed to move in the distance among the trees. Fog enveloped everything around him, but the treetops revealed flashes of light that made the scene look surreal. "I don't like this," Eduardo murmured, but no one paid any attention to him. The group continued to move forward, ignoring the weight of fear that seemed to follow them, watching them at every step. Finally, after several minutes walking in silence, they arrived at a small clearing. There, hidden among the trees, was the house. The structure was old, with broken windows and wooden walls that showed the passage of time and decay. The house, however, seemed to have something that made it stand out from the rest of the landscape, a palpable energy, as if the whole place was charged with something dark, something ancient. The door of the house was ajar, which increased the bewilderment of the friends. "This isn't right," said Laura, who had always been the most cautious of the group. His eyes swept over the doorway and his stomach churned. Despite her fear, curiosity drove her to take a step forward. "It's okay," Carlos insisted, pushing the door effortlessly. "It's just an abandoned house. Surely there is only dust and cobwebs. Come on, let's go in." The group looked around. The trees, though imposing, could not hide the fact that something strange was happening in that place. The feeling of being watched did not disappear, but intensified. but the excitement of exploring the interior of the house overcame their instincts, and one by one they entered the hall. The air inside the house was heavy, dense, as if time itself had stopped there. The walls were covered with dark stains that, at first, were thought to be simple marks of moisture. However, as they progressed, something else became apparent. In the shadows of the main room, blurred figures could be seen, as if they were watching them from the corners, waiting. Carlos turned off the lantern and, with an expression that tried to hide his discomfort, whispered, "Let's explore a little more. Surely there is nothing." At first all seemed calm, though a sense of uneasiness hung over them. Every step echoed in the void, and the echo of their voices was lost in the heavy air. But soon, a series of strange noises began to fill everything. A crunch here, a whisper there. Lucy shuddered and looked at the others, trying to see their faces, but the darkness had completely enveloped them. Eduardo took out his mobile phone to use the flashlight, but the screen flickered before turning off completely. "What the hell?" Eduardo growled, rubbing his eyes as if trying to clear the fog from his mind. It was then that a sound coming from the upper floor broke the absolute silence. A dull thud followed by something that seemed to be dragging on the floor. Lucia, visibly pale, gritted her teeth. "I don't like this," he said in a trembling voice. "There's something about this house, something that's not right." Carlos ignored her and began to climb the stairs, determined to explore. With each step, the sound of the creaking of the old wooden floor became more and more unbearable. Javier and Laura followed him closely, with fear marking his every move. Edward, for his part, remained in the hall, looking nervously at the shadows that stretched on the walls. Fear overwhelmed him, but he did not want to be the first to abandon the expedition. Upon reaching the second floor, the group found themselves in a long hallway, where open doors gave way to empty rooms. However, something else caught his attention. A room at the end of the hallway was closed with a rusty door that seemed to have remained intact despite the years. Curiosity, mixed with the growing sense of dread, pushed them closer. When they opened the door, an icy air enveloped them, as if time had frozen at that very moment. Inside, an ancient full-length mirror reflected their distorted images, as if they were seeing something that didn't belong there. Lucia's eyes widened as she saw a shadowy figure reflected in the glass. But when she turned, there was nothing behind her. The silence became absolute. The fear grew, and the shadow seemed to stretch all over the room, as if somehow the house itself wanted to devour them. "It's time to go," Eduardo said, his voice firm but nervous. He had had enough. However, before he could take a step back, the door slammed shut, leaving them trapped inside. The light from their flashlights flickered, and the sound of something heavy creeping in again was heard louder. Suddenly, an evil presence became apparent. Something ancient and powerful had been waiting, watching, and now, at last, it had decided to show itself. The air became denser, and the darkness around them began to come alive. A dull scream could be heard in the distance, the sound of something that was not human, something that had been part of that house long before they arrived. The walls seemed to shrink, the house creaked, and friends began to feel the pressure on their breasts, as if they were being crushed by an invisible force. The echoes of the screams began to multiply, and the feeling of panic took hold of everyone. A gasp escaped Javier's throat, and he collapsed to the ground. Lucia, terrified, tried to open the door, but her trembling hands could do nothing. A shadowy figure appeared in front of them, a tall, dark silhouette with empty eyes that reflected a darkness much deeper than the night itself. The evil that inhabited the house was there, manifesting itself in a tangible form, ready to reclaim what belonged to it. Carlos, trembling with fear, cried out, "Run!" But the figure's voice was louder, a deep, unnatural whisper creeping into their minds. "There is no escape. This is what belongs to me." Terror began to dominate everything. With no way out, no hope, the group of friends watched as the figure advanced towards them, absorbing the light of their lanterns, devouring their heat. The darkness swallowed everything. The house, old and cursed, had made its final claim. And in that last moment, the screams were absorbed by the house as if they had never existed. The story of the house in the woods ended there, with darkness as the only witness. There was something unsettling about the mirror that had come into the house that morning. It wasn't big enough to fill an entire wall, but it had an unmistakable presence. Its dark wooden frame looked antique, with intricate engravings that got lost in detail, as if a hidden history was etched into it. No one in the family had ever seen anything like it before. It was said to be a valuable item, brought from an antique sale by a close family friend. No one gave it importance at first. It was just a mirror, right? The family was excited about the new ornament in their home. The patriarch Roberto decided to place it in the hallway right in front of the front door. A suitable place, he thought, to welcome visitors. No one seemed to notice how strange it was, but something in the air seemed to change every time someone passed in front of him. As if the reflection not only showed what was in front of him, but also what was not yet seen. The first to notice it was Sophia, the eldest daughter. She was 16 years old, a teenager who was used to life at home. Like any other morning, he woke up early, got ready for school, and before leaving, he walked down the hallway to make sure the door was locked. It was then that his eyes met the mirror. She watched him nonchalantly at first, but something stopped her. In the reflection, her own image seemed to be distorted, as if something dark surrounded her. What first surprised her was not his face, but what was behind him. A dark figure with empty eyes who was watching her in silence. Sophia's heart skipped a beat, and in the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared. She wasn't sure if it had been a light trick or something else, but she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of discomfort. All day, Sophia tried to forget what she had seen. She told her mother, but she downplayed it, believing that it was just an illusion caused by tiredness. However, every time she passed through the hallway, she felt that the mirror was watching her, as if waiting for her to look again. And when he did, the dark figure reappeared, always in the same place, always lurking. That night, while the family was having dinner, Sophia couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. She felt that the mirror was calling her, that she was trapped in her reflection. Her mother, Clara, noticed her uneasiness and asked if she was okay, but Sophia only nodded silently, her eyes lost somewhere far away. That night, while the others were sleeping, he decided to face the mirror once again. At first, he didn't see anything, but after a few moments, the image returned. The dark figure rose in front of her, lighter than ever. This time, it wasn't just a silhouette. His face was distorted by indescribable horror, as if the shadows consumed him. Sophia tried to move away, but something kept her fixed, trapped by the empty gaze of the figure. A shiver ran down his spine as he heard a soft whisper, like a voice coming from afar, but at the same time, from close by. The figure opened its mouth but made no sound. He just stared at him, as if he knew what Sophia feared. And suddenly, a sense of panic enveloped her, as if the air thickened around her. In her mind, she saw terrifying images, such as a future where darkness slowly devoured her, where everything she loved faded away. The mirror was not just an object. It was a doorway to a sinister future, where humanity's deepest and most terrifying truth was reflected. When Roberto woke up the next morning, Sophia was no longer in her bed. At first, she thought she had left early, but after a couple of hours, worry settled in her chest. He searched the house, calling her by name, but there was no answer. It was then that he saw the door to the corridor ajar. He approached cautiously and entered. The mirror was there as if nothing had happened, but there was something different. The air was heavy, stale, as if an evil presence had taken possession of the place. Looking at the reflection, he saw Sophia, standing in front of the mirror, motionless, with an expression of absolute terror etched on her face. But the scariest thing was what was behind it. The dark figure was there, closer than ever. Before Roberto could react, Sophia's reflection began to move on its own. The image in the mirror showed the young woman screaming, trying to break free from the dark figure around her. But Roberto couldn't hear her. She tried to reach her daughter, but every step she took seemed to push her further away. Finally, with a desperate cry, Roberto tried to break the mirror, hoping to free Sophia from the terrifying vision. But when he hit the glass hard, it didn't break. Instead, the dark figure turned to him, and a shiver ran through his body. The shadow began to take shape, becoming human, but with an evil presence that chilled the blood. It was as if the darkness itself had come to life. Roberto tried to back off, but he couldn't. The figure slowly approached, and its empty eyes flashed with an intensity that made his skin stand on end. As he looked at her, Roberto felt as if his whole being was fading away. It was not only fear that dominated him, but the knowledge that there was no longer escape, that the mirror had already taken his soul. Terrified, Roberto tried to scream, but his words did not come out. Only a whisper came out of his mouth as if something was taking over his voice. Time seemed to stand still, and the dark figure surrounded him. As the shadow sucked him in, he saw something even more terrifying. In the reflection of the mirror, he saw the future of his family. a future where everyone would be devoured by darkness. The sight filled him with despair, but it was too late. Sophia disappeared from the house that night, leaving no trace. No one saw her leave. The family tried to move on, but something had changed in them. Everyone's eyes became empty, as if there was no humanity left in them. When the sun went down, no one dared to approach the mirror. They knew that when they looked at him, something else would look at them. The hidden truth that the mirror reflected was more terrifying than any monster. It was the truth of their own destinies, their own inner horrors manifested before them. The family never recovered from what happened. No one saw Sophia again, and little by little each member of the family vanished, one by one, consumed by the same shadow that had stalked them all. The mirror was still there, waiting, reflecting more and more terrified souls. No one knew how many had already succumbed to the power of that cursed object. No one dared to approach, but it still stood there, in the hallway, reflecting the truth of human darkness. The mirror of truth didn't just show the future. It showed the worst in each being, a truth that could never be forgotten. It was a gray afternoon when Emily, exhausted from the long journey, decided to take an alternate route on her way home. The deserted road stretched for miles, surrounded by growing darkness. There were no signs of life or other vehicles, only the roar of the wind and the distant chirping of crickets. The engine of her car echoed in the stillness of the landscape, and she took the opportunity to relax. As she drove, she began to feel a strange sensation, as if she were being watched. She shook her head and told herself that it was just tiredness. However, something was not right. His phone above the passenger seat vibrated suddenly. Emily frowned at the screen. He didn't recognize the number, but decided to answer, hoping it was an important call. "Hello, who's talking?" she said in a tired voice, trying to sound calm. At first there was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Emily raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "Hello?" he repeated, looking at the phone with growing uneasiness. Finally, a trembling voice emerged from the darkness on the other end of the line. "Help me. Please," said the male voice, full of despair. "I'm trapped. I don't know where I am. There's something here. Something that is looking at me. He's chasing me." Emily felt a wave of discomfort run down her spine. The voice was distorted, as if the man was in a dark, terrifying place. "Who are you?" he asked, his pulse racing. Fear was beginning to creep into his voice. Before he could receive an answer, the call was abruptly cut off, leaving only the echo of the stranger's heavy breathing. Emily, her hands sweaty, looked at her phone for signs of life, but there was nothing. There were no messages, no missed call logs, just the blank screen. He stared at his phone for a few seconds, his mind racing for answers. Just a joke, he thought. It must be someone playing with me. However, a strange sensation lingered in the air. She decided to continue on her way, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, Emily tried to forget what happened, blaming it on the stress and fatigue of the trip. However, something inside him told him not to ignore it. She was used to being alone on her travels, but she had never felt anything so unsettling. The latent sense of danger never went away. One night, after arriving at her apartment, Emily checked her phone and saw something that left her paralyzed. A message without a sender or any information. When he opened it, he saw a recording. She played it without knowing why, as if something pushed her to do it. The audio that began to play was the same as that of the mysterious call. The same desperate voice, the same gasping breath. But what made her tremble with terror wasn't just the voice. It was the sound of a whisper filtering through the end of the recording. Something enigmatic, almost inaudible, but clearly audible to anyone paying attention. "Don't look back," the whisper said like a warning. A shiver ran through his body. Suddenly he realized that there was something much more sinister behind that call. Something dark that was following her. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't ignore it. He decided to investigate. However, I had no idea what I was about to discover. Emily began to go through her phone logs, looking for something that might lead her to understand what had happened on the road. When he accessed the call history, something strange happened. There on the list, he saw the call from the unknown number, but with a peculiar detail. The time she was received did not coincide with the time she had been behind the wheel. It was as if the call had been recorded long before she answered it. The mystery increased, but something worse awaited her. That same night, Emily began receiving text messages. They were short, meaningless, but chilling. "You're closer than you think," said the first. The following message came shortly after. "Don't leave the house." Another, an hour later. "Time is running out." The messages intensified as the days progressed. Emily couldn't ignore them. She began to feel like she was being watched constantly, even though there were no obvious signs that anyone was around. At all hours, I felt the presence of a shadow, something I couldn't see but that was always lurking. The situation escalated when, one morning, Emily woke up with the feeling that something was not right. The air was dense, as if the atmosphere itself were charged with electricity. When she got out of bed and looked out the window, she saw something that left her paralyzed. On the other side of the street, in the gloom, there was a figure. Tall, thin, motionless. A figure she couldn't identify, but who seemed to be staring at her. Panic took hold of Emily. He closed the curtains quickly, trying to calm himself. I needed to get out of there. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but he felt that his life was in danger. He picked up his phone and saw one more notification, a message with an attachment. The file was a photo taken from his own window, showing his figure looking out. The tall and slender figure was now closer. So close that I could see her eyes, which glowed in the dark. In a fit of desperation, Emily ran to her car and drove to the place where she had first received the call. The deserted road, now covered in a thick fog, seemed even more unsettling than before. When he arrived at the scene, he turned on the car's lights, looking for any sign of what had happened. There, in the darkness, he saw something on the ground. It was his phone. The phone I'd forgotten. The phone that had witnessed everything that had happened. Upon picking it up, the device turned on its own, and a new notification appeared. "You are too close to finding out the truth. Now there is no turning back." A heart-rending scream filled the air, and Emily felt something horrible loom over her. The phone began to make a strange sound, as if something was happening on the other end of the line. However, there was no one there. Everything was silent, except for the sound of his own breathing, quickened by fear. Emily tried to run, but the ground began to shake under her feet. At that moment, a dark figure emerged from the fog. It was the same being in the photo, his face deformed and his gaze fixed on her. She had no human face, only empty eyes that stared at her with terrifying intensity. The figure moved forward, sliding on the ground, and Emily, paralyzed with terror, tried to scream. But his voice did not come out. Only the sound of fog and heavy breathing surrounded her. The phone fell to the floor, and with it all hope. The figure caught up with her, and Emily disappeared into the darkness, absorbed in the terror that had haunted her from the moment she answered that call. The investigation that followed was puzzling. The phone, which was found at the scene, contained more messages. Some sent before Emily's disappearance, others after. The recordings and photos she had received indicated that someone had been following her from the moment she accepted that call. No one knew who was behind the threat, but the case remained unsolved. The authorities never found a concrete clue, and the forgotten phone remained stored as a macabre memory of the inexplicable. Emily's disappearance became a legend, a horror story whispered in the dark, where the forgotten phone was the key, and the figure in the fog, the eternal nightmare that haunted those naive enough to answer an unknown call. The cold, damp wind slipped through the cracks of the broken windows of the old hospital, which stood imposingly in the darkness. The structure had been abandoned decades ago, but the stories and legends of what happened inside were still alive in the memories of those who had survived its mystery. The walls creaked with each gust of wind, and the thick fog surrounding the building seemed to whisper forgotten secrets, as if the earth itself was trying to hide what had happened there. Some people said that the hospital had been the scene of illegal medical experiments during its time of operation, and others spoke of lost patients who never left their rooms. But there was one legend that was kept alive, a story that ran cold in the blood of anyone who heard it. The story of a girl who had disappeared without a trace. It was said that his spirit continued to haunt the ruins, searching for answers and taking those who dared to investigate. That night, a group of young people determined to discover the truth behind the unexplained events had arrived at the hospital. They were bold, skeptical of the stories the townspeople told, but they would soon discover that the darkness hiding in this place was more real and more terrifying than they had ever imagined. The door to the hospital creaked as it opened, revealing a crumbling lobby. The air was stale, laden with the smell of mold and rot. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the old ceiling lamps hung at odd angles, as if they were about to fall. The only light illuminating the place was from their lanterns, which cast eerie shadows on the rubble-strewn ground. "This is scarier than I imagined," said one of the young men, named Samuel, as he looked around with a mixture of disgust and curiosity. "Come on, let's not be cowards," replied Laura, the bravest of the group. "We just have to find the girl's room and record a video to prove that this is all just village stories." They pushed deeper into the hospital, following a narrow corridor that twisted like a snake. The atmosphere was thick, almost palpable, and the silence was only interrupted by the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Suddenly, something stopped them. A soft sound, like a child's laughter, could be heard in the distance. "Did you hear that?" whispered Laura, looking around nervously. "Probably the wind," Samuel said, trying to play it down, but his voice trembled a little. However, the laughter persisted. It wasn't the happy, clean sound of a little girl playing. It was a distorted laugh, as if someone was taunting them, leading them into the unknown. Laura squeezed the handle of her flashlight and began to walk toward the source of the sound, her steps quick and determined, but her face reflected a growing concern. "Come on, we're not here to be scared," he said, though his voice sounded increasingly unsure. Suddenly, as they turned a corner, they found themselves in front of a room that seemed different from the others. The door was ajar, and through the crack they could see the silhouette of a tiny figure inside, moving from side to side. The girl. "It's her," Laura murmured, her eyes fixed on the figure. "The girl of the legend." Samuel looked around, his instinct telling him that they must leave, but something was holding him in place. "This is not right. We shouldn't be here." "Shut up," Laura ordered, opening the door with a thud. The figure in the room immediately stopped, and the light from the flashlight illuminated the girl's face. He was smiling, but his smile was not that of an innocent child. His eyes were dark, empty, and his skin paled into a sickly hue. The girl stared at them, but she did not move. What are you doing here?" asked Laura, trembling, though she tried to look confident. The girl didn't answer, just pointing to the back of the room where there was an old hospital bed covered in dust. "Come," he whispered in a voice that seemed to come from a faraway place. "Come and play with me." "Did you hear that?" whispered Samuel, an expression of horror on his face. What's going on here?" Laura, as if under some kind of spell, began to move towards the bed, but her body stopped every time she approached, as if an invisible force was pushing her back. "No, I can't move," he said desperately. Samuel tried to reach her, but something stopped him in his tracks. A horrible and heart-rending scream filled the air, coming from the back of the corridors, and suddenly the lights of their flashlights began to flicker. The girl's laughter returned, this time louder and closer, as if she was surrounding them. The air became denser, almost unbreathable. "We have to get out of here now," shouted Samuel, tugging on Laura's arm. But the girl stared at them, and a dark shadow emerged behind her, taking shape. It was an indescribable creature with sharp claws and red eyes that reflected the light of its flashlights like mirrors. "Run!" Laura shouted as the creature advanced toward them. But there was no way out. Every door they tried to open was tightly closed, and the building was beginning to crumble around them. The corridors lengthened endlessly, as if the hospital were slowly gobbling them up. The girl's whispers, growing more and more intense, enveloped them. "Come and play, come." Suddenly, everything stopped. The hospital was completely silent. The lights went out. The echoes of laughter faded into nothingness. Laura and Samuel were paralyzed with terror, unable to move. The girl was no longer there. The creature had also disappeared. Only darkness remained. The next day, the villagers found the young men's cameras, but not them. Only the echoes of their voices remained, and in the recordings the girl's laughter resounded, closer and closer. No one else dared to enter the hospital after that night. The rumors grew. They said that the girl's spirit was still trapped in the hospital, waiting for others to dare to challenge her. And so, the abandoned hospital continued its eternal vigil, a place of shadows, terrors, and dark secrets. Night hung over the house with an eerie stillness, silence only interrupted by the occasional sound of a branch hitting the window. Laura was in her living room, embraced by the gloom that filtered through the curtains. The dim light of the table lamp dimly illuminated the book in his hands. In those moments of loneliness, I always found solace in the pages of a good novel, an escape from the daily grind. Tonight, however, something seemed different, something in the air that he couldn't clearly identify. The wall clock struck 9 and Laura heard a noise that broke the tranquility. A soft knock, as if someone were knocking on the door. He got up from the couch and walked toward the entrance, a slight feeling of discomfort running down his back. I never expected visitors at that time. He looked out the window before opening the door, but saw no one. A shiver ran through his body, though he tried to ignore it. After all, it could be children playing or someone in the wrong house. He opened the door and there he was, a man standing in his doorway. He had a serious appearance, with a dark jacket and a hat that partially covered his face. Laura stared at him, bewildered. She didn't recognize him, but there was something in his eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Good evening," the man said in a deep but calm voice. "Laura, right?" Laura frowned, overwhelmed by a growing sense of unease. "Yes, but I don't know you. How do you know my name?" The man smiled slightly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I told you, Laura. We know each other, even if you don't remember it." Laura blinked, confused. What was he talking about? She had never seen that man in her life. How could I meet her? The air in the room seemed to have become dense, as if the atmosphere itself was being charged with something indescribable. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," Laura said, trying to remain calm as she took a step back. "I don't know you." The man stood there, motionless, watching her with an uncomfortable intensity. Without saying a word, his eyes flashed for a moment with a strange light. Laura, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to close the door. But before he could, the man stepped forward, preventing him from doing so. "You don't need to be nervous," she said with an eerie calm. "I just want to talk. It's important." Laura's heart began to pound. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her was telling her to be alert. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the house, which had once been her refuge, suddenly seemed like a strange alien place. "What do you want?" he asked in a thin voice, trying to stay in control. The man stared at her before answering. "Come with me. There are things you need to remember." A shiver ran down Laura's spine. What things should I remember? The feeling of fear invaded her completely, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel intrigued. Something about the way the man spoke made her feel like she couldn't just refuse him. "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave," he finally said, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. But the man didn't seem to flinch at the threat. "You can do it if you prefer," he replied with unsettling calmness, "but it won't change anything." Laura felt a growing pressure in her chest. The need to understand what was happening prompted her to take a step back, reluctantly allowing her into her home. The man walked into the room with terrifying naturalness, as if he had been there thousands of times before. "I shouldn't have," Laura muttered to herself, though she knew it was too late. The door closed with a dull sound, and the house was filled with an ominous calm, as if time itself had stopped. The air seemed denser, and the darkness thicker. She sat down on the couch, unable to take her eyes off the man. He sat down in front of her, his arms folded, staring at her. "What I want you to remember is that," he finally said. "Remember what you forgot." Laura frowned, completely bewildered. "I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't know you. Who are you?" The man stared at her, and for an instant, Laura saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was as if there was a connection between them, something deep and ancient that I couldn't comprehend. The feeling of dread grew inside him. "I am someone from your past," he replied, his voice deeper. "Someone who knows you better than you think, and something you forgot comes looking for you." Laura didn't understand what was happening, but the man's words echoed in her mind. Something in his tone, in his gaze, caused a feeling of deep terror to take hold of her, a primitive fear, as if something that had been hidden for a long time was about to be revealed. "Leave me alone," he said, rising quickly from the couch. But when she turned to the door, a piercing cry stopped her. "You can't run away from who you are." The scream echoed throughout the house, and at that moment Laura felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. He looked at the man in horror, feeling the air grow even denser, as if his own breath was getting heavier and heavier. "What do you want from me?" he murmured, his voice trembling, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man slowly got up, approaching her unhurriedly, as if he knew there was no escape. "What I want you to remember is that you remember everything you have forgotten." Laura backed away, but the shadows of the house seemed to envelop her, barring any attempt to flee. His heart was pounding, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. The man looked at her with that same frightful calmness, and at that moment, she understood something that made her blood run cold. She was no longer alone. It all started on a gray afternoon when Anna and her mother decided to move to an old house on the outskirts of the city. The house, despite its rustic charm, was far from what Anna had imagined. The walls creaked, the air smelled of old wood and dampness, but what troubled her most was her inexplicable sense of being watched, even when she was alone. Anna had heard stories about old houses, especially those that seemed to have lives of their own. In the village, it was said that the house had belonged to a family that had mysteriously disappeared, but Anna did not give importance to those rumors. She had always been a rational girl, skeptical of anything she couldn't see or touch. However, everything changed one night when the young woman discovered an object that completely altered her perception of reality. While exploring one of the rooms on the second floor, Anna found a large gold-framed mirror covered by a dusty sheet. At first, she thought it was just an old, forgotten piece of furniture, but something prompted her to uncover it. As he removed the cloth, his eyes fell on the mirror, which seemed to glow faintly despite the darkness in the room. Her reflection seemed paler, distant, almost as if she were seeing someone else instead of herself. Anna tried to ignore this strange sensation and with effort took the mirror to her room. He placed it next to the wall, making sure it was well framed. That same night, after dinner, she got ready for sleep, but something made her turn to the mirror. There, in the reflection, he saw something he would never have expected to see. A creature, a strange figure who did not belong to the reality he knew. His face was distorted, a mixture of shadows and grotesque shapes. His eyes were not human, but two dark spheres that seemed to absorb the light from the room. Although the reflection was Anna's, the creature was there, staring at her. Her mouth stretched into a macabre smile, and at that very moment Anna felt a chill run through her body. Without thinking, he turned off the light and crawled under the covers, trying to calm his accelerated breathing. That night, he couldn't sleep. With each blink, he felt that the creature was closer. The sound of her footsteps echoed in her ears, though she knew she was alone in the room. Each time he dared to look into the mirror, the creature's figure came a little closer. The next morning, Anna woke up hoping that it had all been a dream, but the sense of dread was still intact. Days passed and the creature did not disappear. Although Anne tried to avoid the mirror, her presence became more and more evident. At first it only appeared in the reflection of the mirror, but soon it began to manifest in other places. The young woman saw it reflected in the bathroom window, in the metal surface of the refrigerator, even in the shine of the silver spoons. It was everywhere. Most disturbing of all was the feeling that the creature was following her. Wherever he went, he always seemed to be watching her from some reflection. Anna tried to talk to her mother, but she, not experiencing the same, thought that her daughter was exaggerating. The young woman then decided to look for answers on her own. One night, after researching on the internet, he discovered stories of haunted houses and cursed objects. He found stories about ancient mirrors, mirrors that reflected not only the visible but also the hidden, what should not be seen. He studied several similar cases, where mirrors not only acted as portals to another dimension, but were also doors to nightmarish creatures, dark beings trapped in a parallel reality that fed on fear. Anna, terrified, realized that she had fallen into a deadly trap. The mirror was not just an ancient object, but a conduit to an evil entity, something that had been released by uncovering it. His fate was sealed. The more time he spent near the creature, the stronger his influence over it became. One night, while Anne was sitting in her room, the creature appeared again in the mirror. This time it was not only reflected in him. Her eyes left the surface of the glass and stared at her, as if she could break through the barrier that separated her world from Anna's. The creature began to whisper unintelligible words, but the young woman could hear its name amidst the tangle of grotesque sounds. Fear paralyzed her, and she felt her soul begin to be absorbed by that evil presence. Anna decided that she could no longer live like this. She needed to get rid of the mirror before the creature completely devoured her. With frantic determination, he dragged him into the backyard, and with a hammer began to beat him mercilessly. Each blow seemed to release more dark energy, an invisible power that surrounded her and almost made her lose consciousness. Finally, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, but even after destroying it, the terror didn't go away. For days, Anna began to notice something strange. The creature was no longer reflected on surfaces, but I could feel its presence in every corner of the house. It didn't matter how many mirrors or shiny surfaces I destroyed. The creature was still there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to take it over completely. Anna was no longer the same. Each night, the creature's whispers followed her into her dreams, distorting her mind and altering her perception of reality. The young woman could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was not. When she looked in the mirror of a public bathroom, or in the reflection of a window, she saw the dark eyes of the creature watching her, and she felt her soul slowly fade away. The creature had escaped from the mirror and was now inside her, trapped in her mind, like an eternal shadow that could never escape. Anne had become his prisoner, and there was no way to free herself. Sarah had been looking for something different, something out of the ordinary. As an adventurous young woman with a brave heart, she had traveled countless lonely paths, explored dark forests, and faced extreme situations, but always with the certainty that, in the end, everything had a logical explanation. But tonight would be different, very different. It was a cold, rainy night when he decided to get away from the city and venture out to an old hotel that had been in the news, mostly for stories of mysterious disappearances. But as always, Sarah didn't believe those rumors. He thought that people were carried away by superstition and baseless fears. The hotel, an old building with worn brick walls and moss-covered windows, looked like something out of a horror movie. The lights flickered faintly, and the air was permeated with a smell of mold and rotting wood. Sarah, however, was undeterred. He decided that it would be the perfect place to spend a quiet night, away from the rush and pollution of the city. Once she entered, the receptionist, an older man with deeply tired eyes, looked at her without saying a word, handing her a key with a brass plate bearing the number 12. There was no warm welcome or smile. Something in the atmosphere was already beginning to feel strange, but Sarah didn't think about it. She just thanked her and headed towards her room. The door creaked as it opened, and the light inside flickered a few times before stabilizing. At first glance, the room looked normal, although the furniture was covered in dust, as if no one had been there in years. The mattress was too firm, but Sarah wasn't going to let that ruin her night. He left his backpack on the table and sat on the bed, enjoying the silence that enveloped the place. A few hours passed, and the rain was pounding against the windows. The sound, initially relaxing, soon began to feel unsettling, as if the hotel was breathing slowly, like a living entity. It was at that moment that he heard it. A low, almost inaudible whisper came from the walls. Sarah frowned, trying to figure out what it was. Maybe the sound of the wind or some crack that made noise. But as the whisper persisted, it began to take on a more definite form, something that clearly could not be explained by the wind. Sarah, Sarah. It was the only thing the voice repeated softly and constantly. Fear began to take hold of her. It was not a coincidence. Someone or something was trying to communicate with her, but who or what? With his heart pounding in his chest, he got out of bed and walked over to the wall where the whispers were coming from. The skin on his back stood on end, and his hands trembled slightly as he touched the cold, wet wall. Suddenly, the whisper stopped, absolute silence. But before she could take a step back, a new feeling enveloped her. A shudder in the air, as if the room itself had changed, as if an invisible weight were pressing down on his chest. The temperature dropped suddenly, and Sarah could see his breath condensing in the air. Instinctively, he took his mobile phone out of his backpack. The phone, her only connection to the outside world, was the only way she felt safe. When he turned it on, he saw that he had several missed calls and unread messages, all coming from his sister. But what really caught his attention was a strange notification. A recording had been added to her video gallery, a file she hadn't recorded. Intrigued, Sarah began to play the video. The screen lit up with the image of the room where he was, but something was there. Not good. The camera was shaking and the light was flickering more intensely. In the video, a dark figure moved on the edge of the room, barely visible, like a shadow that seemed to dissolve into the darkness. "Sarah, you have no way out." He muttered the voice in the video, a voice that wasn't his own. A deep, guttural whisper that made her instinctively retreat. The figure began to slowly approach, and the moment the shadow touched the camera, the video abruptly cut off. Fear took over Sarah, and a sense of panic invaded her body. She was not alone. Something or someone was watching her, but I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. He ran to the door, trying to get out of the room, but the lock wouldn't respond. He tried once more and again with increasing desperation. The whispers began again, louder, closer. Sarah, Sarah, ... Breathing rapidly, Sarah turned to the window and saw in the distance the figure of a man standing on the threshold of the hotel door, staring at her. A man with a cold, empty expression on his face. In his hand, he was holding a shiny object, something that shone with a strange and unnatural light. It was at that precise moment that the light of the lamp flickered violently and went out completely. Darkness surrounded her completely, and the whisper became a deafening scream, an indescribable sound that seemed to pierce her mind. In desperation, Sarah tried to scream, but her voice faded into thin air. The darkness sucked her in and her body collapsed to the ground. When the light came back on, the room was empty. The receptionist the next day found Sarah's phone on the table next to the bed with the message she had recorded herself before disappearing. "Don't trust the hotel. It's cursed." The hotel returned to its usual silence, but those who passed by said that sometimes, at dusk, they could hear the whispers coming from the walls. A group of 5 friends, all with hiking experience, decided to go on a trip to the Shadow Hill Forest. They had heard the stories and legends that haunted that place since they were children. Stories that spoke of unexplained disappearances, of people who never returned after entering the forest. However, what originally seemed to be a challenging adventure would quickly turn into a nightmare that would test not only his bravery, but his deepest fears. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the edge of the Shadow Hill Forest. The treetops formed a dark blanket that blocked much of the light. Despite the sinister reputation of that place, the 5 friends did not let fear stop them. They were used to walking in nature, and they believed that stories were just that, stories. They decided to camp near a clearing, a small open area between the trees, which offered them a quiet view of the starry sky. They prepared to spend a relaxed night surrounded by nature, not knowing that this would be the last moment of calm they would experience. As the night wore on, the shadows of the forest seemed to lengthen, and a strange stillness came over the place. None of the friends could remember exactly when it started, but something changed in the air. The wind stopped blowing, and a deep silence invaded the space. Suddenly, one of the group members, Sarah, felt someone watching her. He turned toward the forest, looking for some sign, but saw nothing but the impenetrable darkness of the trees. "Did you hear that?" asked Sarah, her voice trembling slightly. The others were silent, listening intently, but there was no response. Everything was too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by the sound of something rustling in the distance, as if someone were walking through the dry foliage. "It's just the wind," Mark said, trying to sound confident, but his tone wasn't as convincing as he thought. Suddenly, a piercing scream broke the stillness, coming from somewhere nearby. They all got up, terrified, looking around. The sound was so close, but they couldn't see anything. "What was that?" muttered John, his voice raspy on. The group decided that it would be best to leave the camp and return to the starting point, but something prevented them from moving. A sense of unease bound them to the ground, as if the forest would not let them escape. That's when something strange began to happen. Sarah, the most intrepid of the group, stepped forward and began to walk into the woods. "I'm going to investigate," he said without hesitation. The others tried to stop her, but something in her eyes made them hesitate. She seemed to be being drawn to something beyond her comprehension. Suddenly, Sarah disappeared into the trees, as if the forest itself had swallowed her. His friends called his name, but there was no answer. The darkness swallowed all sound, and panic began to take hold of them. "Sarah!" Mark shouted desperately, running to where he had last seen her. But when he reached the edge of the forest, he found only a series of strange footprints, deeply marked on the ground, which disappeared into the blackness of the forest. There was no trace of her. The friends stared at the footprints, terrified. They knew something wasn't right, but the darkness prevented them from seeing beyond. They decided to look for it, but as they went along, the atmosphere of the forest seemed to become denser, as if they were being watched by something they couldn't comprehend. The footprints were getting stranger, as if something had painted them on purpose. "This doesn't make sense," muttered Emma, who was visibly shaking. "Why are there symbols on trees?" The symbols were strange, incomprehensible, with geometric shapes that did not correspond to any culture they knew. The figures seemed to move subtly as if they had a life of their own. The feeling that someone or something was stalking them intensified. Every time they approached one of the symbols, a cold current ran through their bodies, and a shiver ran through them. The group, now completely nervous and not knowing what to do, decided to return to the camp to think of a plan. But when they arrived, something worse awaited them. The camp was completely messy. The backpacks were open, the equipment was scattered on the ground, and the campfire had already been extinguished. The scariest thing, however, was the fact that Sarah's footprints were still there. But instead of disappearing into the forest, they were returning to the camp, surrounding the area where they were now. "What's going on here?" John whispered, his eyes filled with terror. A low, almost imperceptible whisper hung in the air. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "Help! Help! Help!" he repeated, echoing like an echo. "It's Sarah," shouted Emma, hoping she was still nearby. But the echo only multiplied, repeating the name of each member of the group, distorted and sinister. In the background, something moved quickly among the trees. A low whistle, like that of a creature in the dark, cut through the air. Panic broke out. Suddenly, Mark disappeared. None of them saw him leave, but when they turned their heads to look for him, he was gone. Only the footprints remained, which seemed to crawl into the forest, into the deep and unreachable. With terror running high, the group began to run, but every step they took seemed to be in vain. The forest, which had at first seemed like a challenge, now closed in on them like a trap. Darkness enveloped them. Branches creaked as if something was moving quickly, and the voices of their missing comrades echoed in their ears. One by one, the figures of friends began to disappear. First Emma, then John, and finally only Clara remained, looking around in horror, unable to comprehend what was happening. She looked up at the sky, looking for the moon, looking for the light, but everything seemed to get even darker. The ground beneath his feet began to shake. And then, he saw it. From deep within the forest, a tall, thin figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, but it wasn't a beast either. His face was covered by a black cloak, and his eyes shone with a deep, piercing green glow that seemed to pierce his soul. The creature raised a hand, and Clara felt a pressure in her chest, an excruciating pain that forced her to fall to her knees. "Welcome, Clara," whispered a deep, guttural voice, as if coming from the very bowels of the forest. "You're the last." With a final scream, Clara disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The forest of Shadow Hill had claimed its last victim. The echoes of the lost voices echoed through the air, while the symbols on the trees shone with a spectral light. No one else came back from that forest. And the cycle continued, waiting for new unwary people who, like the group of hikers, would challenge the legend and disappear one by one into the darkness of Shadow Hill. The road stretched out before him like a snake, winding through the vast desert of night. The man, Juan, had begun his journey at sunset, and although the empty, dark landscape did not worry him at first, something was beginning to change in the air. It was as if darkness itself was breathing, waiting, lurking. The radio, turned on in an attempt to fill the silence, emitted only static, a low, annoying sound that, for some reason, kept unsettling him. The journey must have been long, but Juan had already traveled more than half of the route. The endless road and the loneliness of the night were beginning to take their toll on his mind. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, he could see a faint light, a kind of glow in the distance. At first he thought it was another vehicle traveling in the same direction, but over time, the light began to look more and more like a lingering shadow, as if it was following him, lurking at his distance. It wasn't a car like the others. It was something he couldn't clearly identify, but the feeling of being watched, of being pursued, took his breath away. The light in his rearview mirror didn't disappear. It didn't fade like a car taking an exit or pulling off another road. No, that light was still there, always behind him, like an invisible weight on his back. Sweat began to tarnish his forehead. There were no signs of other roads or gas stations for miles, only him and the light. What was happening? He accelerated slightly, hoping that the distance between them would increase, but it didn't happen. The light remained there, fixed. In the back of his mind, a small voice began to whisper, a voice he had never heard before tonight. "You are not alone." Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he saw the light of a gas station in the distance. It was a small oasis in the middle of nowhere. but to him it represented the only refuge that could offer him some security. He approached quickly without looking back. The car that had followed him was still far away, but in his mind, it was too close. As he stopped by the gas pump, a shudder ran through his body. The gas station was empty with no one in sight. The only light came from fluorescent tubes that buzzed and flickered irregularly. The air, hot and heavy, seemed to crush him, and the smell of gasoline enveloped him in an oppressive atmosphere. John got out of the car quickly and began to fill up the tank, his trembling hands moving awkwardly down the hose. He glanced sideways at the car that was still stationary at a safe distance, just across the road. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I felt his presence as if I were watching his every move. At that moment, a figure emerged from the shadows, walking towards him with long, calm steps. The man didn't say a word, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He was wearing a long coat and a cap that partially covered his face. The figure stopped a few yards away from John and, with a soft but deep sigh, spoke. "You're going to need a lot more than gasoline to escape what's following you," the figure said quietly, his tone deep and filled with a strange echo that seemed to reverberate through the air. Juan took a step back, his heart began to beat harder. The feeling of terror ran down his spine like an icy chill. Who was this man? How did he know what he had been feeling? Trepidation invaded him completely, but he could not help asking, "What do you mean by that?" His voice sounded tense, forced. I didn't want to know the answer, but curiosity got the better of fear. The stranger raised his hand, pointing toward the car on the other side of the road. Juan looked over there, but could see nothing to confirm the man's strange statement. The distance between them was too great, and darkness enveloped everything. However, when he turned his gaze to the figure in front of him, the man was already closer, too close. "The car, it's not what it seems," he said with a frightful calm. "He's there because he has a reason. And you have been chosen." Panic took hold of Juan, and a shiver ran through his skin. Chosen for what? What did all this mean? Suddenly, the sound of the car that had been following John grew louder, rapidly approaching. The headlights illuminated the gas station with a blinding light. But the worst thing was not the light, nor the sound of the wheels on the asphalt. The worst thing was the sensation that ran through his body. It was as if everything was in slow motion, as if time itself had been distorted. The pressure in his chest choked him. Something was not right. The man in front of him smiled slightly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, which was still as cold and empty as the shadow around them. "It's not an accident, my friend. No one who enters this road leaves it without leaving something behind. And now you have something that belongs to them." Before Juan could react, the car that had been following him pulled up next to him. The driver's door slowly opened. The driver, a man with a cold, empty stare, peeked out. There were no emotions in his eyes, only the intensity of someone who had witnessed something beyond human comprehension. "It's time for you to pay," the driver said in a guttural voice, as if the words came from a distant and gloomy place. Juan tried to take a step back, but his legs did not respond. Terror had completely paralyzed him. The stranger's figure looked at him one last time, and his face changed into a grimace of horror, as if he finally understood what was about to happen. The driver of the car walked towards him, and with a quick movement grabbed his arm. John tried to struggle, but the strength of the man's hand was inhuman. A strange noise filled the air, as if something was torn inside, something that shouldn't be there. "We've been waiting for you," the driver said, his tone now full of malice and control. "This is the last stop for you, pal." The darkness around them closed in on them, and the gas station began to fade into nothingness. The lights flickered, and the sound of the car's headlights was all that remained. An indescribable chill enveloped him, and for a moment John felt that he was being sucked into the darkness itself. The strange man disappeared, and the road in front of him dissolved into the void. The car, which once seemed so real, was now just another shadow in the eternal night. And the man who had followed him, it no longer existed. Juan was no longer there. A normal weekend. That was what they thought when they began to organize the getaway. A group of friends decided to spend a few days away from the hustle and bustle of the city, looking for rest and moments of fun in an isolated house by a lake surrounded by forests. No one imagined that this place hid dark secrets that only the darkness of the night would be able to reveal. The house, old and made of wood, stood alone on a small island, connected to the mainland by a narrow bridge that creaked as it passed. In the distance, the water of the lake reflected the gray sky, enveloped by a thick mist that seemed never to rise. The air was humid, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was the only thing that broke the silence. No one in the group thought about the dense and heavy atmosphere surrounding the place. For them, it was simply an escape from the routine, an opportunity to enjoy nature. The friends, excited and full of energy, unloaded their backpacks and began to explore the house. It was spacious, with time-worn furniture, and while it looked cozy inside, something about its structure made it feel unsettling. The walls creaked at every step and the lights twinkled in the darkness, as if the house were alive, watching. In the afternoon, after lighting a fire and drinking something by the lake, they began to notice small details that they could not explain. The basement door, which was locked with an old padlock, seemed heavier than normal. Some of them thought it was a simple security measure, but the tension grew as the night progressed. When darkness fell completely, the feeling of discomfort in the air intensified. The trees seemed to move, although there was no wind. The water in the lake reflected the moonlight in a strange way, as if something was moving beneath the surface. No one wanted to talk about it, but everyone felt it, latent fear lurking. They decided it was time to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. The strange noises of the house and the murmurs of the water made rest impossible. In the early morning, someone heard footsteps crawling down the hallway. The sound was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then it got louder. One of the friends, Sarah, decided to get up and check what was going on. He peered into the dark hallway, but there was nothing, only the echo of his breathing. When she returned to her room, something made her stop in front of the window. The lake seemed darker and the fog thicker. From his spot, he could see something floating in the water, a shadow slowly moving toward the shore. Sarah felt a pressure in her chest, an indescribable terror that forced her to take a step back. At that moment, a soft, chilling laugh echoed in his ears, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from the depths. The darkness of the night took over everything around him. That same night, the friends began to experience what seemed to be a shared nightmare. Strange visions, shadowy figures peeking out of the water, and incomprehensible whispers creeping into their dreams. When they woke up, the fear did not dissipate. They felt a strange presence, as if something or someone was constantly watching them. By the next day, the weather had worsened. The fog had covered the entire lake, and the wind was blowing hard, shaking the windows of the house. The atmosphere was becoming more and more suffocating, and the group of friends decided it was time to leave. But when they tried to cross the bridge onto the road, they realized something terrifying. The bridge was no longer there. What was left was just a crumbling of driftwood, as if something had violently torn it off. Panic broke out in the group. No one could understand how that had happened overnight. They tried to use their phones to call for help, but the signal was completely dead. The feeling of being trapped in that place, unable to get out, increased by the second. That's when they decided to investigate the house, hoping to find a way out or something that would help them understand what was happening. They searched every corner, including the basement, but found nothing but dust and cobwebs. However, something led them to open a secret door that they hadn't noticed before. Behind the door, a steep staircase descended into the depths of the earth. They descended cautiously, the air becoming denser as they went. The light from the lantern illuminated mold-covered walls and strange old symbols that seemed to be written in blood. A foul smell began to fill the air, a mixture of dampness and putrefaction that made them feel even more uncomfortable. At the end of the hallway, they found a dark room with an ancient altar covered in melted candles. Around the altar, there were pieces of wood that seemed to belong to the destroyed bridge. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and a deep guttural roar echoed through the walls. Something was moving in the shadows, something that had been waiting, observing for centuries. The house, the lake, it had all been part of a forgotten ritual, one that had been interrupted. And now, with their presence, they had released something that should have remained locked up. The friends tried to run, but the shadows were moving quickly, enveloping them, trapping them in a nightmare of panic. The walls began to close, and laughter of something monstrous filled the air. The water of the lake on the surface of the altar began to boil, and the figure of something indescribable emerged from the depths, its monstrous form creeping towards them. The last thing they saw was the figure coming out of the water, and the sound of their muffled screams was lost in the mist. The darkness was absolute. The figure emerged from the water with unnatural speed, crawling over the damp earth of the basement, as if it had no limitation on its movement. Each of the friends felt an indescribable terror, as if his very soul were devoured by the presence he had been waiting for, hidden in the depths of the lake. The monster rose, its silhouette twisted and monstrous, its eyes shining with an evil, empty light. He was not human. It was not an animal. His body seemed to be an amalgam of shadows, water, and inorganic forms, a being created from nightmares and ancient horrors. The skin was translucent, with dark veins running through it as if his blood were the same darkness that emanated from the bottom of the lake. His face was a mixture of distorted human faces, each caught in an expression of agony, as if the being was an entity that took lost souls. A scream echoed through the air, but it wasn't a human one. It was a call, an invocation. Something was awakening, something that had been waiting for the right moment to break free, and the sacrifice of those who dared to interrupt his rest was the key to his freedom. The friends tried to flee, but the basement seemed to have transformed into an endless labyrinth. The walls closed around them, crushing them, as the sound of the approaching monster grew louder and louder, deeper. An icy chill filled the air, the kind of cold that wasn't from the temperature but seemed to seep deep into the bones. The fear they felt was physical, as if their hearts beating hard could be heard by the entity. Desperation was palpable in the air. When they finally reached the end of their flight, they found an exit on the other side of the house, but the water of the lake had invaded everything, slowly rising up the walls, as if the house itself were being devoured by the water that had always been its prison. There was no escape. With a last-ditch effort, some of the friends tried to swim to the lakeshore, but the current quickly swept them away. The water surrounded them, covered them, absorbed them, as if the lake itself were a living being that swallowed its victims, returning them to the depths from which they should never have emerged. At the last moment, the screaming stopped. When everything was silent, the house remained there still, like a tomb that kept its secrets, waiting for new, unwary people who, like the previous ones, would arrive without knowing that they were already marked. Fog enveloped the place, and the water of the lake seemed calm, but beneath its surface something was stirring, something waiting, and the shadow that emerged from the bottom had the promise that his hunger would never be satisfied. The lake house remained a vestige of what it once was, its dark history plunged into oblivion. No one dared to approach after that night, and those who did never returned.